This video is dedicated to the unsung heroes of the American Old West, the men, women, and children who toiled, suffered, and persevered in a landscape both breathtakingly beautiful and brutally unforgiving. Their stories, often lost to the annals of time or overshadowed by romanticized narratives, deserve to be heard. This work is a humble attempt to give voice to their experiences, to acknowledge the grit, resilience, and sheer will to survive that define their lives. It is a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure hardship, to adapt to the most challenging of environments, and to forge a life in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. It is dedicated to those who faced the daily struggle for survival, who endured scorching deserts and blizzards alike, who wrestled with starvation and disease, and who knew the constant threat of violence and lawlessness. Their stories are not tales of heroic cowboys and daring gunfights, but rather narratives of quiet courage, of quiet desperation, and of the constant, often seen battles fought for mere existence. It is a dedication to the mothers who bore children in makeshift shelters, the fathers who toiled endlessly to provide, the children who grew up amidst violence and scarcity, and the marginalized communities who endured prejudice and discrimination in a land that promised opportunity but delivered often hardship and inequality. This book is also dedicated to those who seek a more truthful and nuanced understanding of the American West, a narrative that moves beyond the myths and legends to grapple with the complexities and contradictions of a time marked by both expansion and exploitation, progress and pain. It is for those who are curious not only about the glamorous side of the Wild West, but also about the dirt under the fingernails, the weariness in the eyes, and the quiet strength of those who lived and died in its unforgiving embrace. May this work serve as a reminder of the human cost of westward expansion and the enduring legacy of those who built a nation on the foundations of both hope and hardship. Their sacrifices and their struggles deserve to be remembered, not just as historical footnotes, but as powerful and enduring narratives of the human experience. The year is 1870. Dust, the color of sun-baked clay, hangs heavy in the air, a tangible presence clinging to everything: clothes, skin, the very hope in the hearts of the weary travelers. 3 wagons, their wooden wheels groaning in protest against the relentless Montana terrain, lumbered across the seemingly endless expanse of prairie. Each wagon represented a family, each family a microcosm of ambition, desperation, and the fragile dream of a better life. The first wagon, larger and sturdier than the others, belonged to the Millers. Elias Miller, a grizzled farmer from Iowa, his face etched with the lines of hard work and worry, held the reins. Beside him, his wife Martha, her hands calloused but her spirit unyielding, kept a watchful eye on their 3 children. Huddled within the cramped confines of the wagon, they were leaving behind a failing farm, hoping to find prosperity in Montana's promised land, a land painted in rosy hues by land speculators' pamphlets. Their resources were meager, but their determination burned bright. Trailing behind them was the smaller wagon of the Ortegas, a Mexican-American family escaping the prejudice of the South. Antonio Ortega, a skilled carpenter, held on to hope that the West offered a chance at a new life, free from the constant shadow of discrimination. His wife, Isabella, a woman of quiet strength and resilience, clutched a worn rosary, her prayers a constant companion on this arduous journey. Their youngest daughter, Maria, eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear, clung to her mother's side. Their possessions were few, their journey fraught with far more uncertainty than the Millers. Bringing up the rear was the wagon of the Johnsons, a family of recent Irish immigrants. Patrick Johnson, a strong man burdened by grief and the memories of the famine that had ravaged his homeland, silently steered his battered wagon. His wife, Bridget, her face a mask of quiet sorrow, held their infant son close. Her only solace in this uncertain world, they had risked everything to escape poverty and hardship, hoping that the vastness of the American West would somehow alleviate the crushing weight of their past. Their resources were even scarcer than the Ortegas, their future a daunting unknown. The landscape was a brutal teacher. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the earth into a parched and cracked canvas. Days bled into weeks, each marked by the monotonous rhythm of creaking wagons, the occasional cry of a child, and the constant threat of a breakdown or a sudden storm. Clean water was scarce, food supplies dwindled, and the ever-present dust choked their lungs and coats their mouths. Each mile felt like a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. Evenings brought a temporary reprieve from the relentless heat, but the cold nights offered little comfort, the prairie wind whispering tales of hardship and isolation. The vastness of the plains, the towering presence of the rugged mountains pressed down upon them, a stark reminder of the insignificance of human endeavor against the raw, unforgiving power of nature. It was a constant struggle, not just against the elements, but also against the gnawing fear that their dreams would be consumed by the very landscape they were crossing. The differences in their resources became increasingly apparent. The Millers, with their slightly better provisions and stronger wagon, were able to help the others on occasion, but even they were feeling the strain of the journey. The Ortegas, resourceful and skilled, managed to eke out a living along the way through hunting and bartering, but their lack of financial resources was a constant worry. The Johnsons, however, were barely surviving, their limited supplies dwindling at an alarming rate. These early days foreshadowed the unequal distribution of resources, opportunity, and even survival that would mark their life on the frontier. As they traversed the landscape, the families experienced a range of emotions. The initial optimism, fueled by dreams of prosperity and a fresh start, gradually eroded, replaced by a mixture of weariness, apprehension, and the cold, hard reality of their situation. The differences in their backgrounds and experiences shaped their responses to the hardships they faced. The Millers' steadfast faith provided a source of strength, while the Ortegas' resourcefulness and communal spirit proved essential for their survival. The Johnsons, despite their hardships, clung to a quiet determination, a testament to the tenacity of the human spirit. The journey was also a crucible, revealing the underlying tensions and conflicts that would define their relationships in the years to come. The Millers' initial generosity was gradually tested by their own dwindling supplies. The Ortegas' resourcefulness sometimes clashed with the Millers' more traditional farming methods. The Johnsons' quiet desperation put a strain on their relationships with the other families, leading to moments of friction and unspoken resentments. Even the vast prairie itself seemed to amplify the differences between the families and create a subtle rivalry for resources, not only among themselves, but the unknown obstacles they might soon face. The landscape itself became a character in the narrative, a harsh, unforgiving character that tested their endurance and shaped their destinies. The sun-scorched plains, the towering mountains, the ever-present dust, and the unpredictable weather were more than just obstacles. They were forces of nature that demanded respect, threatening to crush the fragile hopes of those who dared to challenge them. The arrival at their destination was not a triumphant moment, but rather a weary sigh of relief, a temporary respite before the true challenges of establishing a life on the frontier lay ahead. This journey was merely the beginning. It was a testament to the courage, resilience, and the desperate hope that drove these families towards an uncertain future. They had arrived on the edge of civilization, the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, but what that chapter would hold remained to be seen, filled with the potential for both great triumph and crushing defeat. The dust settled on their weary forms, but the dust of their dreams, tempered by the harsh realities of their surroundings, had yet to completely settle. The true test of their resolve was yet to come. The wagons, battered and weary, finally reached their claimed land, a seemingly endless expanse of parched earth under a sky the color of bleached bone. The promised land, it turned out, looked less like a bountiful garden and more like a desolate battlefield against nature itself. The initial relief at the end of their arduous journey quickly evaporated under the relentless Montana sun. The optimism that had sustained them through weeks of hardship began to crack, revealing the raw anxiety beneath. The first task, the seemingly insurmountable task, was clearing the land. The soil, stubbornly resistant, yielded only to hours of backbreaking labor. Axes bit into the tough, gnarled roots of scrub oak and juniper, the metallic clang echoing across the silent expanse. Hands, already blistered from the journey, became raw and bleeding, a testament to the unrelenting nature of their new reality. The Millers, with their slightly greater strength and better tools, made faster progress than the Ortegas and Johnsons, but even their efficiency was dwarfed by the sheer scale of the work. Days bled into weeks, each marked by aching muscles, relentless sweat, and the constant presence of dust, a fine, gritty film that coated everything and seemed to seep into their very bones. Building shelter was the next monumental hurdle. The scant lumber they had managed to bring with them was woefully inadequate for the three families. They had to improvise, scavenging for whatever materials they could find: rough-hewn logs, mud, and even strips of buffalo hide. The resulting structures were far from elegant. They were rudimentary shelters, barely offering protection from the elements. The Millers managed to construct a somewhat more substantial cabin, their combined strength and experience giving them a slight edge. The Ortegas, with Antonio's carpentry skills, fashioned a smaller but relatively sturdy dwelling. The Johnsons, however, struggled, their lack of experience and dwindling resources resulting in a lean to barely sufficient to keep the elements at bay. The differences in their housing mirrored the disparities in their resources and abilities, highlighting the inherent inequalities of their circumstances. The harsh realities of the climate were a constant threat. Unpredictable storms raged through the canyons, whipping up blinding dust devils and sending sheets of rain cascading down, turning the already difficult ground into a treacherous mire. The scorching sun, beating down mercilessly during the day, baked the earth, further depleting the meager water supplies. The nights were equally unforgiving. Bitterly cold winds howled through the inadequate shelters, chilling them to the bone. The struggle for clean water became a daily ordeal. They hauled it from a distant spring, each bucket a hard-won prize against the formidable landscape. Even the smallest task felt like an epic battle against the unforgiving elements. Planting crops was another challenge, fraught with unforeseen difficulties. The soil, dry and rocky, offered little nourishment. The seeds, carefully brought from Iowa, seemed to struggle to take root in this alien environment. Pest infestations added to their woes. Swarms of grasshoppers descended upon their meager crops, devouring everything in their path. The lack of knowledge about local pests and appropriate farming techniques added another layer of difficulty. The Millers, accustomed to farming in Iowa's fertile soil, struggled to adapt to this harsh environment. Their traditional methods proved largely ineffective. The Ortegas, more attuned to the rhythms of the land, demonstrated a greater level of adaptability, utilizing indigenous methods. But their success was limited due to the scarcity of water and the unpredictable weather. The Johnsons, with their minimal resources and lack of farming experience, barely managed to plant anything of significance. The meager harvests were a grim reminder of the vast difference between their idealized vision and the stark realities of frontier life. Hunger became a constant companion. Their meager food supplies, already dwindling from the journey, disappeared quickly. Beans, jerky, and coffee formed the staple of their diet, supplemented by whatever game they could manage to hunt. But hunting was unpredictable and often unsuccessful, resulting in prolonged periods of hunger and gnawing anxiety. The risk of food poisoning from contaminated water and spoiled food was ever present, adding another layer of fear and desperation to their lives. The children, particularly those of the Johnsons, were particularly vulnerable, their frail bodies weakened by malnutrition and disease. The constant threat of starvation became a grim shadow that hung over them, exacerbating the already immense physical and emotional strain they faced. The initial optimism, that bright flame that had ignited their journey, flickered and threatened to die under the weight of constant hardship. The frustrations grew, exacerbated by the physical exhaustion and the mounting challenges. The initial camaraderie among the families began to fray, replaced by unspoken tensions and simmering resentments. The disparities in resources and capabilities became increasingly apparent, leading to subtle rivalries and unspoken accusations. The shared struggle against the elements, once a uniting force, became a source of friction and division, testing the strength of their bonds. Evenings brought little solace. The flickering candlelight in their makeshift shelters highlighted the bleakness of their surroundings and the stark reality of their situation. The silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the sounds of the wind, underscored their profound isolation. The vast distance from civilization amplifying their sense of vulnerability. Their dreams, once so vibrant and full of promise, now felt fragile and precarious, threatened by the unforgiving reality of their existence. the weight of their struggle pressed down upon them, threatening to crush the hope that had brought them to this unforgiving land. The dust, that pervasive symbol of their new environment, seemed to settle not just on their clothes and skin, but also on their dreams, dimming their luster but not entirely extinguishing the ember of hope that still flickered within. The fight for survival was far from over. It was merely the beginning of a long and arduous battle for existence. The land, as harsh and unforgiving as it was, would prove to be both a relentless adversary and an unexpected teacher, shaping their destinies in ways they could never have imagined. Their homestead, a symbol of their aspirations and a testament to their endurance, would be a constant battleground, where dreams and harsh reality clashed. The struggle for survival on the Montana frontier had begun, a struggle that would test the limits of their endurance and redefine their very being. The first sighting of the native population wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but a fleeting glimpse, a wisp of smoke curling from a distant canyon, the fleeting shadow of a horse against the bleached landscape. It was enough, however, to ignite a mixture of apprehension and curiosity within the settler families. The idealized vision of a pristine, uninhabited wilderness shattered, replaced by the unsettling reality of prior inhabitants, their presence a tangible reminder that this land wasn't empty, but merely waiting to be reclaimed. The Millers, with their ingrained prejudices rooted in decades of westward expansion narratives, reacted with a mixture of suspicion and hostility. Their initial reaction was defensive, a reflection of the ingrained fear that permeated the frontier mentality. They spoke in hushed tones, their words laced with anxieties about potential conflict and the unknown. Their worldview, shaped by tales of savage attacks and land disputes, predisposed them to see the Native Americans as a threat, an obstacle to their dreams of prosperity. They fortified their makeshift cabins, sharpening their axes and loading their rifles, preparing for a confrontation they weren't sure was coming. Their actions, fueled by fear and ignorance, laid the foundation for a potentially volatile relationship. The Ortegas, however, displayed a more nuanced perspective. Antonio, whose family had experienced hardship and displacement in Mexico, seemed to possess a deeper understanding of the complexities of cultural conflict. He cautioned against hasty judgments, suggesting a more cautious and observant approach. His wife, Isabella, shared his concern and emphasized the importance of learning their ways and languages. While they were not free of prejudice entirely, their experiences had imbued them with a certain empathy, a recognition that the native population were not just faceless antagonists, but people with their own histories, cultures, and reasons for being on this land. They observed from a distance, carefully studying the smoke signals and the patterns of movement, trying to decipher the meaning behind their actions and understand their intent. The Johnsons, caught between the extreme views of the Millers and the more cautious observation of the Ortegas, were paralyzed by uncertainty. Their limited experience, coupled with their precarious position, left them vulnerable and indecisive. They lacked the resources and the confidence to engage with the natives directly. They lived in fear of the unknown, constantly looking over their shoulders, their apprehension compounded by their already overwhelming challenges of survival. Their silence spoke volumes. They were onlookers, trapped in their own fear, observing the burgeoning relationship between their neighbors and the native population with a growing sense of unease and helplessness. The initial encounters were sporadic and indirect. One evening, a lone Native American approached the Miller's cabin, his appearance a mixture of the familiar and the unfamiliar. He was draped in hides, his face weathered and etched with the wisdom of the land, his eyes sharp and observant. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, a stark contrast to the desperation etched on the faces of the settlers. He offered a simple trade, some dried meat for a rusty knife. The Millers, caught off guard, initially hesitated, their ingrained prejudices battling with a primal instinct for survival. The exchange was brief, almost tentative, marked more by unspoken anxieties than clear communication. Yet it was a significant moment, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of cultural differences. Subsequent encounters were similarly cautious. The native population, a band of Crow people, continued to observe the settlers from a distance. The settlers, in turn, watched their movements, their fear gradually giving way to a tentative curiosity. There were silent exchanges of goods, dried berries for tools, pieces of cloth for furs. These interactions were far from friendly, but they weren't overtly hostile either. They were silent negotiations, a recognition of shared needs and a mutual acknowledgement of each other's presence in this contested landscape. However, these tentative exchanges were punctuated by moments of significant friction. The settlers grazing cattle occasionally strayed onto land traditionally used by the Crow, leading to tense confrontations. The settlers' misunderstanding of property rights and their perceived ownership of the land clashed violently with the Crow's deep-rooted spiritual and practical connection to the territory. The Crow, witnessing the settlers' relentless pursuit of land exploitation and their seemingly boundless ambition, viewed them as a growing threat to their way of life. One incident involved a stolen horse, leading to a heated exchange that nearly resulted in violence. This underscored the precariousness of their relationship and the underlying tensions that threatened to boil over. The escalating scarcity of resources, water and game in particular, further aggravated the situation. The settlers' thirst for expansion, their relentless pursuit of land and resources, were viewed as aggressive by the Crow. The Crow themselves had been facing the dwindling resources due to ecological factors, making the arrival of settlers a particularly threatening development. The dwindling supply of buffalo, a staple of their diet, only fueled their concerns about the long-term impact of the settlers' presence. The settlers' disregard for the land's delicate balance and their voracious consumption of its resources exacerbated the existing tensions, transforming the quiet anxieties into outright conflict. The conflicts weren't always violent, but were imbued with a simmering resentment that hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the precarious balance that existed between survival and annihilation. The contrasting cultural values also played a significant role in shaping their interactions. The settlers' emphasis on individual gain and private property stood in stark contrast to the Crow's communal approach to land and resources. Their different perceptions of time and space further contributed to misunderstandings and misinterpretations. The settlers' linear perception of time clashed with the Crow's cyclical understanding of the seasons and their reverence for the natural world. These fundamental differences made peaceful coexistence a daunting task, requiring a degree of mutual understanding and adaptability that was rarely forthcoming. Despite the inherent conflicts, there were moments of surprising cooperation. The Ortegas, recognizing the Crow's intimate knowledge of the land, sought their guidance in navigating the treacherous terrain and finding sources of clean water. In exchange, they shared some of their limited food supplies. These instances of cooperation, though limited, highlighted the possibility of coexisting, albeit a fragile one. The narrative of the first encounters was not a romanticized tale of heroic cowboys and noble savages. It was a complex tapestry woven from fear, suspicion, misunderstanding, and occasional cooperation. It was a story of survival, of cultural clash, and of the constant tension between competing needs and aspirations in a land that promised both prosperity and destruction. The future of this relationship remained uncertain, a precarious balance hanging between fragile coexistence and potentially devastating conflict, ultimately determined by the choices and actions of both the settlers and the Crow. The land itself, a silent witness to their struggle, held the key to their fate. The relentless sun beat down on the makeshift settlement, baking the earth to a parched and unforgiving crust. The dust, a constant companion, coated everything in a fine layer of grit, clinging to clothes, seeping into lungs, and settling in the cracks of already weary hearts. But the dust was not the only insidious threat lurking in the shadows of this nascent frontier. Disease, a silent, relentless predator, stalked the settlers, its presence a grim reminder of their vulnerability and isolation. It started subtly, a low-grade fever here, a persistent cough there. Initially, the settlers dismissed these ailments as the inevitable consequences of hardship and exposure. The grueling labor, the meager diet, the constant threat of starvation, all contributed to a weakened immune system. But what began as minor inconveniences soon escalated into a full-blown crisis. Dysentery, a cruel and insidious disease, swept through the settlement like a wildfire, leaving a trail of suffering and death in its wake. The first victim was little Lily Miller, barely 5 years old. One day, she was a playful child, her laughter echoing through the harsh landscape. The next, she was racked with fever, her small body convulsing with violent diarrhea. Her mother, Sarah, watched helplessly, her heart breaking with each agonizing cry. The rudimentary medical knowledge of the settlers proved inadequate. They tried traditional remedies, herbal teas, poultices made from mud and bark, but nothing seemed to alleviate Lily's suffering. The child's wails echoed the desperation of a mother facing the inevitable loss of her child, her pleas lost to the vast, indifferent expanse of the prairie. The other children followed suit. Tommy Johnson, known for his relentless energy, withered away, his vibrant spirit extinguished by the relentless onslaught of the disease. Maria Ortega, once so bright-eyed and curious, succumbed to the same fate. The mournful cries of parents echoed through the settlement, a constant testament to the devastating toll of the disease. Each death was a blow to the already fragile community, a stark reminder of the precariousness of life on the frontier. The adults weren't spared. The relentless work, combined with inadequate nutrition and sanitation, left them vulnerable. Though the adult bodies were more resilient, the disease took its toll. Many suffered severe dehydration, their strength sapped, their bodies racked with pain. Weak and exhausted, they were unable to care for themselves, let alone their children. The despair was palpable. The settlers' dreams of prosperity and a better life seemed to crumble around them, replaced by the grim realities of mortality and loss. The boundless hope of a fresh start was smothered by the relentless reality of disease, emphasizing the vulnerability of these pioneers. Their resilience, tested to its limits, threatened to fracture under the relentless pressure. Adding to their misery were the charlatans and quacks who preyed on their desperation. Traveling salesmen, often with dubious credentials and even more dubious remedies, made their way to the settlement, peddling their wares with slick promises and extravagant claims. They offered miracle cures, vile concoctions of questionable ingredients, often more harmful than helpful. Desperate parents, clinging to any shred of hope, paid exorbitant prices for these useless potions, only to see their children's condition worsen. These miracle cures were a dark stain on the landscape, adding insult to injury as they further exploited the vulnerable settlers. The limited medical knowledge and resources were amplified by the complete isolation from civilization. The nearest doctor was days away, a journey too perilous and time-consuming to undertake for many suffering from this rapidly progressing illness. The settlers were entirely on their own, reliant solely on their limited knowledge and meager resources. Their isolation only enhanced the profound sense of helplessness and despair. The vast expanse of the prairie, once a symbol of hope and opportunity, now felt like a prison, trapping them in their misery. The grim struggle against disease was compounded by the relentless heat. The scorching sun intensified the symptoms, compounding the dehydration and weakness, transforming each day into a struggle for survival. The lack of clean water further exacerbated the problem, leading to even more cases of dysentery and other waterborne illnesses. The simple act of finding and purifying water became a daily battle, adding another layer of hardship to the settlers' lives. Amidst the despair, there were glimmers of hope. Neighbors helped each other, sharing what little resources they had and offering comfort where they could. Isabella Ortega, despite her own suffering, tended to the sick children, her gentle touch a soothing balm amidst the chaos. Antonio Ortega, using his knowledge of native plants, helped concoct remedies, some providing temporary relief from the symptoms. These acts of kindness and compassion, though limited in their impact, served as beacons of hope in the shadow of death. They showcased the strength of community forged under immense pressure, a testament to the enduring human spirit. However, the death toll continued to rise. The harsh realities of frontier life were laid bare. The relentless struggle against the environment, the constant threat of disease, and the deep loneliness of isolation. The land, once promised as a source of prosperity and opportunity, transformed into a relentless adversary, exacting a heavy price. Even as the settlers battled to survive the immediate crisis, the underlying truth remained. Survival on the prairie was a daily struggle, a constant battle against the harsh elements and the unseen enemies that lurked in the dust and shadows. The relentless cycle of disease and death underscored the vulnerability of these pioneers. The stark realities of mortality became a chilling counterpoint to the romanticized dreams of a better life on the frontier. The settlers learned a harsh lesson. The promise of a new beginning was inextricably tied to the ever-present threat of an untimely end. The lingering stench of death hung in the air, a constant reminder of the fragility of life in this unforgiving landscape. The grieving families, their hearts heavy with loss, continued to fight for survival, haunted by the memories of their loved ones lost to the merciless grip of dysentery. Their experiences left an indelible mark on the souls of those who survived. The hardships forged a deep bond of resilience and a shared understanding of the unrelenting struggle for existence. The dreams they initially carried with them were battered, but not broken. They were altered, tempered by the harsh realities of their existence, but still held a flickering ember of hope. The dust and dreams coexisted in a precarious balance, a reflection of the challenging and often unforgiving frontier life they faced. The dust swirled around Sarah Miller's worn boots as she knelt beside the meager fire, stirring a pot of beans that promised little sustenance. The smoke stung her eyes, blurring the already hazy landscape. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of relentless labor, moved with a practiced efficiency born of necessity. This was her life, a relentless cycle of cooking, cleaning, mending, and tending to the needs of her family, a life far removed from the romanticized notions of the Wild West. While the men faced the dangers of the open range, the women faced a different, equally brutal reality. Their struggles were often invisible, buried beneath the layers of dust and hardship, but no less significant. Sarah's days began before dawn and stretched far beyond sunset. The water, hauled from a distant well, needed to be purified. The meager supply of flour needed to be carefully rationed. Clothes needed patching, and the relentless scrubbing of dirt from already threadbare garments seemed never-ending. Her days were punctuated by the cries of her children, demanding food, attention, and comfort. Often amidst the constant coughs and fevers that seemed to plague their small bodies, the weight of their survival rested heavily on her shoulders, a crushing burden that left little room for anything else. The isolation was a profound aspect of their lives. News from the outside world was scarce, bringing with it a sense of detachment that was both isolating and unnerving. They were cut off from family and friends, the social networks that provided emotional and practical support in more settled communities. This isolation extended to other women as well. There was little opportunity for socializing, for shared experiences, or for the camaraderie that could provide a sense of relief and support. Each woman was an island, struggling alone against the relentless currents of hardship. This constant struggle was not solely physical. It was deeply emotional. The women bore witness to the daily struggles of their husbands and sons, the constant battle for survival against the harsh elements, and the ever-present threat of violence. They endured the agony of watching loved ones fall ill and die, their hearts torn between the despair of loss and the need to remain strong for the sake of their families. They held the fractured pieces of their families together, their fortitude and resilience, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Yet, despite the challenges, the women's lives were far more than simple drudgery. They possessed an unyielding spirit of resourcefulness and adaptation. They transformed the meager resources available into sustenance, comfort, and a sense of home. They practiced traditional medicine, utilizing herbal remedies and holistic approaches to deal with common ailments. Their deep connection with the land, a connection that came from years of working with it and witnessing its harsh realities, provided a grounded sense of place in a constantly evolving environment. They were not merely passive caregivers. They played an essential role in shaping the daily rhythms and fabric of their communities. In contrast to the women's lives, the men's experiences were defined by physical risk. Their days were spent battling the elements, herding cattle across unforgiving terrain, or toiling in mines that threatened collapse at any moment. Their work was grueling, dangerous, and often lonely. The isolation was palpable. Long days on horseback or underground left little opportunity for social interaction or the simple comforts of companionship. The constant threat of injury, disease, and even death loomed large in their minds, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their existence. The men faced the daily burden of providing for their families. The pressure to succeed, to bring home enough to feed, clothe, and shelter their loved ones, added another layer to the relentless challenges they faced. There was little room for failure. They lived in a perpetual state of vigilance, their senses heightened, always aware of the dangers that lurked around every corner. The burden of financial insecurity was a harsh reality, adding an additional strain on their already depleted mental and emotional resources. The sense of responsibility, coupled with the lack of support networks, led to pervasive loneliness that left many men emotionally isolated, even in the midst of a community. Their interactions were often characterized by taciturnity, a product of their environment and shared experiences. There was no place for displays of vulnerability or weakness. They relied on quiet strength, endurance, and a stoicism born of necessity. The camaraderie forged in shared hardship could be a source of strength, but it was also deeply fraught with unspoken anxieties and concerns. The constant struggle for survival created a hyper-masculine environment where expressing emotion was considered a sign of weakness. Yet these men were not simply hardened frontiersmen devoid of feeling. Their letters to their wives and children revealed a deep love and concern for their families, a fierce protectiveness that was evident in their every action. Their silence was not indifference. It was a mask protecting their vulnerability, a defense against a world that demanded constant strength and resilience. Beneath the surface of their stoicism lay a deep-seated loneliness. The absence of close family ties, the scarcity of emotional outlets, and the ever-present threat of death created a pervasive sense of isolation. While men found companionship amongst each other, these bonds were often built on shared experiences of hardship and danger, leaving little room for genuine emotional connection. And the rugged individualism demanded by the frontier often prevented them from seeking solace or support, reinforcing the cycles of solitude and emotional isolation that characterized their daily lives. The gender roles on the frontier were rigidly defined, limiting the agency and autonomy of women. Their lives were largely confined to the domestic sphere, with limited participation in public life or economic activities. Their voices were often unheard, their experiences largely unseen in the narrative of the Wild West. The constraints imposed on their choices were not a result of choice, but the products of a societal structure that dictated their roles. The weight of expectation to be dutiful wives, nurturing mothers, and resilient caregivers in the face of overwhelming hardship left them with little room for personal growth or self-expression. The absence of legal protections and the pervasive nature of violence further amplified the constraints on women's lives. The lack of opportunities for education or economic independence left them particularly vulnerable. Their legal rights were limited, offering them little recourse in cases of domestic abuse or violence. The perceived fragility of women's bodies made them more vulnerable to exploitation, sexual assault, and other forms of mistreatment. The absence of formal legal systems frequently left victims of such crimes without adequate avenues for justice or protection. In contrast, men held a position of social dominance, their status confirmed through the control they exerted over the financial resources and decision-making within the family. Their lives, though fraught with danger and hardship, afforded them a degree of agency and freedom that was denied to women. This power imbalance, shaped by social norms and reinforced by the harsh realities of their environment, formed the fundamental structure of social relations on the frontier. The contrasting realities of men's and women's lives on the frontier offer a complex and nuanced portrayal of gender dynamics in the Wild West. While both genders faced insurmountable challenges, the nature and impact of these challenges differed significantly, creating a deeply stratified social order that defined the roles and experiences of each sex. This stark contrast between the hardships endured by men and women showcases the reality of frontier life, far removed from the glorified narratives of the Hollywood West. It was a life defined not just by dust and dreams, but also by the unwavering strength, resilience, and the silent struggles of the women who kept the dreams alive. The wagon lurched violently, throwing Sarah against the side. Dust, thick and gritty, filled the air, stinging her eyes and coating her already parched throat. They were nearing Harmony Gulch, a mining camp that promised little comfort and much danger. The whispers about the town had preceded them, a place where fortunes were made and lost in equal measure, where the law was as fickle as the desert winds, and where survival demanded a resilience that tested the limits of the human spirit. Harmony Gulch sprawled haphazardly across the valley floor, a chaotic collection of ramshackle buildings clinging to the hillside like stubborn weeds. Saloons with names like the Hangman's Noose and the Devil's Delight stood shoulder to shoulder with dusty general stores and makeshift dwellings fashioned from whatever materials were at hand. Canvas, wood, even discarded mining equipment. A thick haze of smoke hung perpetually in the air, a blend of wood smoke from cooking fires and the acrid scent of coal dust from the nearby mines. The air itself hummed with a palpable energy, a volatile mix of anticipation, greed, and desperation. The streets, or rather the paths that served as streets, were choked with a sea of humanity. Men, their faces grimy and etched with hardship, hurried past, their eyes watchful, their movements hinting at a readiness for violence. Miners, their clothes stained with coal dust and sweat, jostled with gamblers, their fingers stained with tobacco and their eyes sharp and calculating. Outlaws, their faces obscured by shadows and their hands close to their weapons, moved through the crowd with a predatory grace. A few lawmen, their badges gleaming dully in the harsh sunlight, tried to maintain a semblance of order, but their presence seemed almost comical, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of lawlessness that pervaded the town. Sarah, clutching her children close, felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. This was a world far removed from the quiet solitude of her homestead. Here, the threat of violence was not a distant possibility but a palpable presence, lurking in the shadows, whispering in the wind. She had heard stories of women being assaulted, of miners being robbed and murdered, of justice being meted out with the swiftness and brutality of a rattlesnake strike. Harmony Gulch was a microcosm of the Wild West, a place where the romanticized notions of heroism and adventure shattered against the harsh realities of survival. The town was a crucible, forging characters in its unforgiving fires. It was a place where fortunes were won and lost not just in the mines, but in the saloons, the gambling dens, and the shadowy back alleys where deals were struck and betrayals were common currency. The diversity of the population was striking. Miners from all walks of life, men from Ireland, Germany, China, Mexico, and across the American frontier, toiled side by side in the mines, their differences momentarily forgotten in the shared pursuit of wealth. Their cultures, languages, and traditions clashed and mingled in a chaotic blend, creating a vibrant, albeit volatile, society. Yet, beneath this veneer of multiculturalism lay the undercurrents of racial tension. Chinese miners, often subjected to prejudice and discrimination, faced a constant struggle for survival, often relegated to the most dangerous and poorly paid jobs. Mexican workers, similarly marginalized, were subjected to exploitation and faced discrimination at every turn. These inequities were exacerbated by the lack of legal protection and the pervasive lawlessness of the town. The women of Harmony Gulch faced a unique set of challenges. Many were wives and mothers, forced to endure the hardship and isolation of frontier life, their days filled with the endless tasks of cooking, cleaning, and caring for their families. Others were prostitutes, drawn to the town by the promise of wealth, only to find themselves trapped in a cycle of exploitation and violence. Regardless of their circumstances, the women of Harmony Gulch faced constant threat, their vulnerability amplified by the lack of law and order. They were often at the mercy of the men who ruled the town, their voices silenced, their struggles largely unseen. The law, such as it existed, was a flimsy shield against the pervasive violence. The sheriff, a weary-looking man with a perpetually tired expression, was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of crime. He and his small posse were constantly battling a losing battle against the outlaws, gamblers, and saloon brawlers who operated with impunity. The courts, when they functioned at all, were often influenced by corruption, bribery, and the powerful men who controlled the town. Justice, when it came, was often swift and brutal, dispensed with little regard for due process. The moral ambiguities of frontier justice were constantly evident. Vigilante groups, formed to enforce their own brand of law, often acted outside the legal system, dispensing justice according to their own interpretations of right and wrong. Their actions, often brutal and unforgiving, highlighted the gap between the idealized concepts of justice and the harsh realities of survival. This ambiguity blurred the lines between good and evil, making it difficult to discern the motives of the individuals who shaped the town's narrative. Alliances shifted, betrayals were common, and the very concept of trust was constantly questioned. The atmosphere in Harmony Gulch was thick with tension. Every encounter held a potential for violence. Every shadow concealed a threat. The town lived under a constant state of anxiety, its inhabitants constantly aware of the precariousness of their existence. Yet, amidst this chaos, a sense of community, albeit a fragile one, had emerged. Men and women from diverse backgrounds, bound together by their shared experiences of hardship and their relentless pursuit of survival, found solace and support in one another. These bonds, formed in the crucible of adversity, were complex, often contradictory, but held the promise of a future built not on dreams of gold, but on the resilience of the human spirit. The story of Harmony Gulch was a story not of heroes and villains, but of ordinary people grappling with extraordinary challenges. It was a story of survival, of adaptation, of the complexities of human nature in a world without rules, where the line between justice and revenge was perpetually blurred, and where the fight for survival was a daily battle, fought not just against the harsh realities of the environment, but also against the human capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and unwavering compassion. It was a world where the women, though often overlooked, played a critical role in shaping the community's fabric, their resilience a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Their struggles, often invisible, were as significant as the dangers faced by the men, painting a stark and nuanced picture of life on the American frontier, far removed from the myths and legends that would later shape its portrayal. The air in the hangman's new saloon hung thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and desperation. A haze of tobacco smoke clung to the rafters, obscuring the flickering gas lights that cast long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn wooden tables and bar. The usual cacophony of drunken laughter, raucous singing, and the clinking of glasses was punctuated by a sudden, sharp crack, the sound of a fist connecting with flesh. The brawl erupted with the speed and ferocity of a prairie fire. It began with a shove, a muttered insult, a flash of anger. The ubiquitous tinderbox of the Wild West ignited. Two miners, both Irish, were locked in a brutal grapple, their faces contorted in rage. One, a powerfully built man named Finn, had been boasting of his recent strike, a vein of gold rich enough to make him a wealthy man. The other, a smaller, wiry man named O'Malley, had long resented Finn's success, fueled by a simmering jealousy and the gnawing desperation of a life spent toiling in the mines with little reward. Their fight spilled from a table onto the sawdust-covered floor, sending glasses flying and shattering, the splintering wood adding to the chaos. The other patrons, initially startled, quickly became enthralled spectators. Some cheered, others placed bets, their voices a raucous chorus of encouragement and jeers. A few, sensing the potential for trouble, edged towards the saloon doors, hoping to escape the brewing chaos before it escalated. The bartender, a stoic man with eyes that had seen too much violence, watched impassively, his hand resting casually on the butt of a revolver tucked into his waistband. He knew better than to interfere. This was Harmony Gulch, and saloon brawls were as common as dust devils. The fight between Finn and O'Malley quickly escalated. Other miners, fueled by alcohol and the thrill of the moment, joined the fray, choosing sides based on personal grudges, past grievances, or simply the random whims of drunken aggression. The saloon became a swirling vortex of flailing limbs, flying fists, and guttural shouts. Chairs were overturned, tables smashed, and the air filled with the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. Amidst the chaos, a new element entered the fray, a racial dimension to the escalating violence. A group of Chinese miners, who had been quietly nursing their drinks in a corner booth, were suddenly targeted by a drunken mob. The anti-Chinese sentiment, which ran deep in Harmony Gulch, was suddenly unleashed, fueled by alcohol and the anonymity of the brawl. The mob, emboldened by their numerical superiority and the chaos that reigned, began to attack the Chinese miners, their jeers and curses laced with racial slurs. This new wave of violence added a horrifying layer of brutality to the already brutal scene. The The Chinese miners, outnumbered and outmatched, fought back with a desperate courage born of necessity. Their smaller stature and perceived weakness belied a resilience that surprised even the most hardened onlookers. They fought with a ferocity born of years of facing prejudice and discrimination, their skills honed by a lifetime of working in the dangerous mines. The scene became a nightmarish tableau of violence, a brutal illustration of the racial tensions that simmered beneath the surface of Harmony Gulch. The fight raged on for what seemed like an eternity, a maelstrom of violence that threatened to engulf the entire saloon. The sheriff, alerted by the commotion, arrived with his 2 deputies, their revolvers drawn. But they were hopelessly outnumbered and outmatched. Their attempts to restore order were met with jeers, insults, and even threats. The sheer scale of the brawl, combined with the drunken fury of the participants, rendered their efforts futile. They could only watch as the violence unfolded, their authority rendered meaningless by the chaos. The brawl finally subsided as abruptly as it began, leaving behind a trail of broken furniture, spilled liquor, and injured men. The air hung heavy with the lingering scent of blood and sweat. The sheriff, his face grim, surveyed the scene, his eyes reflecting the bleak reality of his predicament. He knew that many of the participants would disappear into the night, leaving him with the unenviable task of trying to restore order to a town seemingly beyond redemption. The aftermath of the brawl revealed the fragility of the social fabric of Harmony Gulch and the stark absence of a robust justice system. The injuries sustained by the participants ranged from minor bruises to severe wounds. Some were taken to a makeshift medical facility, while others simply limped away, nursing their injuries in silence. There were hushed conversations about retribution, about the scores that needed to be settled. The tension that hung in the air after the brawl was palpable, a grim reminder of the volatile nature of frontier life. The incident served as a stark illustration of the pervasive lawlessness that characterized Harmony Gulch, highlighting the limits of law enforcement in a town where violence was as commonplace as breathing. The sheer brutality of the brawl, coupled with the blatant disregard for the rule of law, underscored the desperation, greed, and prejudice that permeated this microcosm of the Wild West. The fight was not just a drunken brawl. It was a brutal reflection of the underlying social tensions that shaped the lives of those who lived and worked in Harmony Gulch, a microcosm of the struggles and conflicts that characterized the American frontier. The incident served as a grim reminder of the challenges faced by those who sought to establish a society built on justice and equality in a world governed by might and greed. The fragile veneer of community was shattered, revealing the underlying darkness of unchecked violence and prejudice that lurked beneath the surface of this chaotic frontier town. The story of the saloon brawl wasn't just a story of violence. It was a story of the human condition, pushed to its limits in a world without rules, a world where survival itself was a daily battle against the elements and the flaws within humanity itself. The scars left behind, both physical and emotional, would linger long after the dust settled on the Hangman's Noose. The aftermath of the brawl in the Hangman's Noose saloon left a chilling silence in its wake, a silence heavier than the lingering smell of blood and spilled whiskey. Sheriff Brody, his face etched with weariness and frustration, surveyed the damage. His 2 deputies, equally demoralized, stood beside him, their revolvers holstered, their authorities seemingly eroded by the night's chaotic events. The scene was a testament to the powerlessness of official law enforcement in Harmony Gulch, a town where the rule of law was frequently overshadowed by the raw, brutal force of individual actions. The next morning, whispers of a different kind of justice began to circulate. The whispers spoke of the Harmony Gulch Vigilantes, a shadowy group that had long operated on the fringes of the community, their existence both rumored and denied. Their methods were shrouded in secrecy, their actions rarely witnessed firsthand, yet their presence was felt. They were the silent arbiters of a different kind of law, a law born of necessity and fueled by the community's desperation for order in a world seemingly devoid of it. The vigilantes weren't a formally organized group with bylaws and elected officials. Instead, they were a loosely knit collection of individuals, bound together by a shared belief that the existing legal system was inadequate and that swift, decisive action was required to restore a semblance of peace. Their membership comprised a diverse group, a former army sergeant hardened by years of conflict, a respected rancher disillusioned by the sheriff's inaction, and even a few saloon owners who secretly tired of the constant threat of violence impacting their businesses. They weren't all saints. Some had their own questionable pasts and personal vendettas that fueled their involvement, but they were united by a common goal: to impose a form of justice, however harsh, upon those who defied the unspoken rules of their community. Their methods were often ruthless, their judgments swift and uncompromising. They didn't concern themselves with due process or legal niceties. If someone was accused of a crime, they would investigate, often using their own brand of rough justice. If found guilty, the punishment was immediate and severe, ranging from public floggings to banishment, even in extreme cases, extrajudicial executions. There was no trial, no appeal, just a verdict and its immediate consequence. The vigilantes' actions weren't always popular. Many townsfolk viewed them with a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. Their methods were brutal and their actions sometimes questionable, targeting individuals based on rumors and suspicions. Yet, they also provided a sense of security that the sheriff and his understaffed and under-equipped department couldn't match. They were a symbol of a community's desperate attempts to take control of its own destiny, in a world where the official legal mechanisms failed to adequately address the problem of rampant lawlessness. The moral ambiguity of the vigilantes' actions is undeniable. They existed in a moral gray area, operating outside the established legal framework. Their actions weren't always just or fair. They were sometimes driven by personal vendettas, fueled by biases and prejudices common in the era, yet their existence highlighted the fundamental flaws of a legal system unable to cope with the unique challenges of frontier life. Their emergence pointed to a breakdown in the social contract, where the state's failure to protect its citizens prompted the citizens themselves to assume the mantle of justice. One example of their intervention involved a notorious cattle rustler named Jedediah Stone. Stone was a skilled outlaw, known for his ability to evade the law and his ruthless efficiency in stealing livestock. The sheriff, despite his best efforts, had been unable to apprehend Stone, who had become a legend of sorts within the outlaw community, a symbol of defiance against authority. The vigilantes, however, saw things differently. After weeks of shadowing Stone and gathering evidence, they tracked him down to his secluded hideout. They didn't arrest him. They didn't even bother to bring him to a makeshift trial. Instead, they delivered a swift and brutal form of justice. Stone was found hanging from a cottonwood tree the following morning, a stark warning to others contemplating similar crimes. The impact of this act was profound. The subsequent period saw a noticeable drop in cattle rustling. While some mourned the lack of due process, many more felt a sense of relief. Jedediah Stone's fate served as a potent reminder of the power and potential danger of vigilante justice. The incident further amplified the already contentious discussion regarding the balance between order and justice in a society struggling to establish its foundations in a lawless land. Another example involved a dispute over a mining claim. Two rival mining groups engaged in a violent confrontation, resulting in the death of one miner. The sheriff's investigation was hampered by the conflicting accounts and the fear of retaliation. The vigilantes stepped in, conducting their own investigation and eventually identifying the perpetrator. Their punishment, however, was not a hanging or a shooting, but a form of banishment. The perpetrator was forced to leave Harmony Gulch, never to return. This outcome was viewed differently by various factions within the community. Some argued that it was too lenient, while others felt that it was a fair and effective way of resolving the conflict without causing further bloodshed. The existence of the Harmony Gulch vigilantes highlighted the complexities of law and order on the American frontier. It was a society constantly grappling with the tension between self-governance and the need for a legitimate, structured justice system. Their actions were a reflection of the harsh realities of life in a lawless land, where survival sometimes dictated that justice be swift and uncompromising, regardless of the ethical implication. They were a symptom of a society's desperate search for order amidst chaos, a reminder of the limitations of official authority in a world far removed from the rule of law. The vigilantes' legacy remains a subject of debate. Were they heroes who enforced order in a vacuum of official justice, Or were they lawless thugs who only exacerbated the problems they purported to solve? The answer likely lies somewhere within the moral gray areas they inhabited, a reflection of a complex and often contradictory frontier reality. Their actions, though controversial, indelibly shaped the history of Harmony Gulch, leaving behind a legacy of both fear and respect, and a lasting question about the true nature of justice in a world where survival itself was a daily struggle. The moral implications of the vigilantes' actions resonated deeply within the community, sparking debates that lasted for years. Some argued that their brutality was necessary to maintain order in a chaotic environment where the official law enforcement was too weak to respond effectively. Others condemned their actions as unjust and illegal, emphasizing the importance of due process and the dangers of mob rule. The lack of a clear judicial system left a power vacuum, readily filled by the vigilantes, who effectively became a shadow government, imposing their own rules and dispensing their own form of justice. Their existence highlighted the inherent contradictions of frontier life, where the pursuit of justice often clashed with the brutal realities of survival. The vigilantes' actions also affected the social dynamics of Harmony Gulch. Their presence created a climate of fear, especially amongst those who were already marginalized or vulnerable. Suspicion and distrust became commonplace. Individuals were hesitant to report crimes for fear of retaliation from the vigilantes or from the perpetrators themselves. The community's social fabric, already frayed by poverty and violence, was further weakened by the ambiguous nature of this form of extrajudicial justice. The vigilante actions inadvertently created an environment of secrecy and fear, hindering the true process of community building and collective healing. The long-term consequences of the vigilantes' actions were complex and multifaceted. While they successfully suppressed crime in the short term, they simultaneously fostered a culture of fear and distrust. The absence of due process and the arbitrary nature of their judgments sowed the seeds of discontent, leading to further social unrest. The ambiguity of their motives further exacerbated this situation, making it difficult to determine whether their actions were ultimately beneficial or detrimental to the community's long-term well-being. The vigilantes' legacy serves as a potent reminder of the complex relationship between justice, order, and the rule of law, especially in societies facing extreme challenges and a lack of established institutions. In conclusion, the story of the Harmony Gulch vigilantes serves as a microcosm of the larger story of the American Old West. It illuminates the struggles of a community grappling with the realities of lawlessness, the contradictions inherent in attempting to establish justice in a chaotic environment, and the enduring consequences of actions taken outside the bounds of established legal frameworks. Their story is not simply one of violence and retribution. It is a complex narrative of survival, morality, and the ambiguous pursuit of justice on the unforgiving frontier. It is a story that continues to resonate today, reminding us of the enduring tension between the desire for order and the complexities of establishing true justice, even in the face of extreme challenges. The question of whether their actions were ultimately just or unjust remains a lingering and vital point of reflection, shaping our understanding of the American West and the enduring human struggle for fairness and security. The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched earth, baking the already brittle landscape into an oven. Dust devils danced across the horizon, mirroring the turmoil brewing in the hearts of the small group of settlers. Their wagon train, a fragile line of hope against the vast emptiness, had been traveling for weeks, their supplies dwindling with each passing day. Their journey had been arduous, marked by the relentless sun, the scarcity of water, and the ever-present fear of encountering hostile Native American tribes. But nothing could have prepared them for what lay ahead: a band of outlaws. They first spotted them at dusk, silhouetted against the setting sun. Rough-looking men, their faces grim and weathered, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of desperation and malice. They were a motley crew, dressed in a mix of tattered clothing and stolen finery, their weapons gleaming ominously in the fading light. There were at least a dozen of them, their horses lean and wild, their movements suggesting a practiced efficiency born from a life lived on the fringes of society. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the settlers. They huddled together, their faces etched with anxiety. Among them were women and children, their vulnerability stark against the looming threat. The men, though armed, were outnumbered and outgunned. Their rifles, mostly hunting pieces rather than military-grade weapons, seemed pitifully inadequate against the outlaws' well-maintained firearms and their obvious experience in using them. Terrified for their lives, families and other survivors ducked down, and the outlaws surrounded them, slowly, methodically, their movements deliberate and threatening. A tense silence descended, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the nervous whinnying of the horses. The leader, a large man with a scarred face and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 sins, stepped forward. His voice, rough and gravelly, cut through the silence. "We ain't here to hurt nobody," he began, his words laced with a deceptiveness that sent a chill down the settlers' spines. "Just looking for a little something to make our travels a bit easier." His words were a thinly veiled threat, a mask concealing his true intentions. He wasn't interested in easier travels. He was interested in plunder. The settlers knew it, instinctively, their bodies tensing, their hearts pounding in their chests. The standoff stretched into hours, an agonizing dance between desperation and courage. The settlers, despite their fear, stood their ground, their resolve born from a desperate need to protect their families and their meager possessions. They were farmers, ranchers, tradesmen, not warriors. Yet in that moment, facing the cold, hard reality of survival, they found a strength they hadn't known they possessed. The leader, however, sensed their resolve. He saw the steely glint in their eyes, the grim determination that hardened their faces. He knew that a fight would be costly, perhaps even deadly. And for what? A few sacks of flour, some meager supplies, and a few frightened souls? The risk didn't outweigh the potential reward. He was a pragmatist after all, a survivor in a world where survival demanded ruthless calculations. He called off his men, his voice still laced with a menacing undertone. "All right," he said, his words carrying the weight of unspoken threats. "We'll take what's easy, your food and extra horses." The settlers, relieved but shaken, complied. They watched as the outlaws systematically looted their supplies, their hearts sinking with each lost possession. It was a cruel lesson in the realities of the frontier. The thin line between life and death, the ever-present threat of violence, and the cold, hard truth that survival often demanded compromise. But it wasn't merely a robbery. It was a glimpse into the lives of the outlaws. These weren't the romanticized bandits of legend. They were desperate men, driven to the fringes of society by poverty, hardship, and a system that had failed to provide them with a decent life. Their actions, though morally reprehensible, were born from a place of profound despair. One of the younger outlaws, a gaunt youth with haunted eyes, caught the gaze of a young girl amongst the settlers. There was a moment of recognition, a flicker of humanity in his eyes, a brief understanding of the shared vulnerability they both experienced. It was a fleeting moment, quickly suppressed by the harsh realities of their lives, but it served as a powerful reminder that even the most hardened criminals possessed a human core. The outlaws, having taken what they wanted, rode off into the setting sun, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. The settlers were left behind, their spirits broken, but not crushed. They had survived, though at a heavy cost. They had faced the cold, hard reality of the frontier, and they had lived to tell the tale. The encounter left an indelible mark on the settlers, shaping their understanding of the world around them. It was a stark reminder that the Wild West wasn't merely a land of opportunity and adventure. It was a brutal, unforgiving environment where survival was a daily struggle and the line between justice and injustice was often blurred. It wasn't a tale of heroes and villains, but a story of human desperation, survival, and the moral complexities of a lawless land. The incident prompted the settlers to band together more closely, reinforcing their mutual reliance and strengthening their sense of community. The shared trauma forged a bond that proved invaluable in the days and weeks to come. The incident also underscored the limitations of the legal system on the frontier. The settlers knew that reporting the incident to the authorities would be futile. The nearest sheriff's office was days away, and even if they managed to reach it, there was no guarantee of justice or even effective action. The encounter emphasized their isolation, their vulnerability, and their reliance on their own resources and ingenuity to survive. This underscored the importance of self-reliance and mutual support in a society where formal structures of law and order were often inadequate or non-existent. The psychological impact of the event was long-lasting. The settlers' trust in their own judgment was enhanced by the realization that they had to depend on themselves for protection. Their collective experience taught them a hard lesson about the necessity for vigilance and preparedness in a dangerous and unpredictable environment. They also developed a deeper understanding of the motivations and circumstances that could lead to lawlessness, which fostered a more nuanced and complex perspective on the morality of their situation. Their encounter with the outlaws was not just a moment of terror and survival, but a pivotal event in the unfolding story of their lives on the frontier. It marked a turning point in their journey, one that would shape their actions and their collective consciousness for years to come. It reinforced their resolve to persevere, to build a life in this harsh, unforgiving land, and to navigate the complexities of a society where survival and justice were often intertwined. The memory of the outlaws' visit served as both a grim warning and a source of grim determination, fostering resilience in the face of adversity. The settlers learned that the Wild West was not simply a land of endless opportunity. It was a place where survival demanded constant vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront the harshest realities of frontier life. They adapted to the challenges with a newfound understanding of the necessity of mutual support and self-reliance, characteristics that would define their community for years to come. The lingering shadow of their experience with the outlaws served as a constant reminder of their vulnerability and their determination to build a better future. The dwindling supplies weren't the only burden weighing heavily on the settlers. The incident with the outlaws had exposed a deeper, more unsettling truth: the fragility of their existence and the moral compromises necessary for survival. The stolen food and horses represented more than just material loss. They represented a violation of their trust in the supposed safety of their journey, a shattering of their naive optimism. The harsh reality of the frontier was settling in, cold and unforgiving, stripping away the romanticized notions they might have harbored about their westward expansion. Days bled into weeks, marked by the relentless rhythm of survival. The settlers, now more keenly aware of their vulnerability, began to adopt a more cautious approach to their travels. They traveled in tighter formations, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. The women and children, initially protected in the center of the wagon train, were now assigned roles in keeping watch, learning to identify potential threats and respond accordingly. The men, while still carrying their rifles, also began to learn improvised defensive tactics, using the terrain to their advantage and developing strategies for quick response should another threat materialize. The scarcity of food became a daily struggle. Rations were strictly controlled, with each morsel measured and allocated to maximize their limited resources. The sweet taste of honey, once a simple pleasure, was now a precious commodity reserved only for the sick or the very young. Hunting became a necessity, not just a means of supplementing their diet, but a crucial element of their survival. They had to learn to read the landscape, track their prey, and hunt efficiently, avoiding unnecessary risks. But hunting itself became a moral dilemma. The scarcity of game forced them to consider options they would have previously rejected. One evening, a debate erupted over the killing of a mother deer and her fawn. Some argued that it was necessary to secure enough meat for the entire group, while others were morally opposed to killing the fawn, even if it meant less meat. The argument raged on for hours, reflecting their growing desperation and the blurring lines between necessity and morality. The decision, ultimately, was a compromise, a painful compromise that highlighted the harsh realities of their situation. The issue of water became even more critical. They encountered several dried-up water sources, forcing them to ration even more strictly. Thirst became a constant companion, a gnawing reminder of their vulnerability. Even the simple act of drinking water became a moment of calculation, a conscious choice between immediate relief and long-term survival. The settlers witnessed one another's suffering. The sight of parched lips and sunken eyes reminded them of the price of survival, a price not only in material resources, but in their very humanity. Desperate measures followed. They found themselves resorting to practices they would have previously considered unthinkable, One such practice was the harvesting of cactus fruit. The process was arduous, the fruit itself was often tasteless, and there was always the risk of spines causing painful injuries. But desperate times called for desperate measures. It provided a sense of agency, the feeling that they were not only enduring, but acting to safeguard their lives. As they progressed deeper into the wilderness, they encountered more than just resource scarcity and hunger. Their initial naivete about the complexities of the frontier was gradually eroded. They began to observe subtle signs that indicated a different kind of threat, the presence of other groups, not necessarily hostile, but equally desperate for survival. They began to hear rumors of bandit gangs operating in the region, tales of ruthless individuals who preyed on weaker settlements. This fueled a constant undercurrent of anxiety, turning their journey into a race against time and a fight for survival. The moral implications of these encounters escalated. On one occasion, they stumbled upon a deserted wagon train, its contents plundered and its inhabitants vanished. The sight was unsettling, a grim reminder of their vulnerability and the capriciousness of fate. The question of what happened to the previous inhabitants hung heavy in the air. Had they simply fallen victim to the wilderness, or had they been the victims of violence? The settlers' imaginations conjured up disturbing scenarios, reinforcing their sense of unease and anxiety. In a harrowing encounter, the settlers discovered a deserted homestead, the skeletal remains of a family lying near the dilapidated dwelling. The settlers, hardened by their struggles, were forced to contemplate their own mortality and the fragility of life. They learned the hard lesson that the frontier offered no guarantees. The proximity to death changed the settlers. Their moral compass, previously guided by societal norms, was now recalibrated to prioritize survival above all else. They faced choices that challenged their humanity, testing their willingness to sacrifice for the collective good. While sharing their diminishing resources, they had to determine who got what and why, leading to internal conflicts. The collective decision-making process revealed their varied perspectives and values, resulting in heated debates and compromises. The settlers, grappling with the consequences of their choices, began to question their own actions. Had they made the right decisions? Were the sacrifices they made justified? Their sense of justice and morality, forged in the crucible of their experience, was far removed from the comfortable notions they had held before. The journey itself became a crucible, forging a new sense of community, but also revealing the cracks in their unity. The constant struggle for survival exposed existing divisions and created new ones. Accusations of selfishness and accusations of insufficient effort emerged, leading to arguments and heated confrontations. This created an even harsher environment, making it difficult to confront the very real and imminent dangers they faced. The moral compromises they made, therefore, weren't just about food and water. They were about trust, loyalty, and the very essence of their community. In the end, the settlers reached their destination, but the scars of their journey remained. They had survived, but at a cost. Their experiences had irrevocably altered their perceptions of justice, morality, and the meaning of survival. The Wild West, they realized, was not a land of opportunity, but a brutal test of their resilience, their adaptability, and their very souls. The price of survival, they learned, was far greater than they could have ever imagined. The experience transformed them, leaving an indelible mark on their collective consciousness, shaping their identities and their understanding of the world around them. The Wild West, in all its harsh reality, had changed them forever. The survival of the settlers did not represent a simple triumph over adversity. It was a complex tale of moral compromises, tested loyalties, and the enduring struggle between self-preservation and humanity. Their journey highlighted the harsh realities of frontier life and the lasting impact of the choices made in pursuit of survival. The first snowflakes, hesitant at first, then swirling into a blizzard of ferocious intensity, arrived with the chilling premonition of a winter unlike any they had ever known. The wind, a razor-edged knife, sliced through their meager shelters, penetrating the worn fabric of their tents and the cracks in the hastily constructed log cabins. The warmth they had painstakingly preserved began to leach away, replaced by a bone-chilling cold that seeped into their very marrow. The initial panic gave way to a grim determination. The women, their faces etched with worry but their movements purposeful, began the arduous task of reinforcing their shelters against the relentless assault of the elements. They piled extra blankets, layered furs, and even stuffed straw into every available crevice, creating makeshift insulation against the freezing winds. The men, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to ensure the structural integrity of their homes, reinforcing walls, patching roofs, and clearing away the accumulating snow to prevent collapse. The dwindling food supplies became a terrifying reality. The carefully rationed stores, already meager, now seemed pitifully insufficient to sustain them through the long, dark months ahead. The promise of spring felt like a distant dream, a fragile hope flickering precariously in the face of the unrelenting winter's wrath. The familiar comfort of beans and jerky offered little solace against the gnawing hunger. Each mouthful was a conscious decision, a calculated risk to conserve precious calories. The livestock suffered the most. The cattle, weakened by the harsh conditions, huddled together for warmth, their breath clouding the frigid air. Several died during those first weeks, their bodies stiffening in the unrelenting cold, a stark reminder of their vulnerability. The loss was not just of food, but of hope. The animals represented their future, their means of survival, and their demise cast a pall over the settlement. The men spent hours tending to the surviving animals, battling the snowdrifts to reach them, providing supplementary feed, and ensuring they had a modicum of shelter against the elements. The children, usually the source of laughter and energy, fell silent. Their small bodies, ill-equipped to withstand such extreme cold, trembled constantly, their eyes wide with a fear that even their parents struggled to quell. The constant struggle for warmth, the absence of comforting sunshine, and the palpable tension amongst the adults contributed to a growing sense of unease amongst the youngsters. Their laughter, once a bright spot in their days, was now a rare, precious sound. Illness added another layer of suffering. The cold intensified existing ailments, transforming minor coughs into debilitating bronchitis and turning simple cuts into festering wounds. They lacked adequate medical supplies, relying on rudimentary remedies and each other's support to cope with the spreading sickness. The small cabin they shared, intended as a sanctuary, became a place of shared suffering, where the sighs of the sick mingled with the prayers of the healthy. The isolation, previously a source of peaceful solitude, became a crushing weight. The vast, snow-covered landscape stretched before them, an endless expanse of white, devoid of any signs of life. The sense of isolation heightened their anxieties, intensifying the feeling of vulnerability. They were completely alone, adrift in a sea of white. The silence, broken only by the howling wind and the creak of the wooden structures, became oppressive. Nights became a time of fear and uncertainty. The howling wind sounded like tormented spirits, and the shadows of the snowdrifts dancing outside their fragile dwellings seemed to animate into menacing figures. The adults tried their best to maintain an air of calm to alleviate the children's fright, but inside they were grappling with their own fears. Stories exchanged were tales of survival, of courage and resilience. They sought comfort in the collective experience of their hardship. The challenges they faced were not merely physical. They also tested the limits of their social fabric. Tensions flared as food and resources became scarcer. Arguments erupted over the allocation of precious firewood, blankets, and even medical supplies. The initial sense of community, forged in shared adversity, began to fray as desperation threatened to unravel the bonds of solidarity. They had fought bandits and wilderness, only to find a new foe in themselves. But even amidst these hardships, a remarkable resilience emerged. They helped one another with unflagging commitment and loyalty. The stronger members of the community shouldered a greater share of the burden, providing support and encouragement to those who were weakened by illness or hunger. They shared not just their scant supplies, but also their hopes and fears, drawing strength from their shared experiences and mutual reliance. Creativity and resourcefulness were critical to their survival. They devised innovative ways to gather additional food. Trapping became an essential skill, requiring immense patience, skill, and knowledge of the harsh winter terrain. They learned to identify edible plants, even under a thick blanket of snow, supplementing their diets with whatever meager sustenance they could find. The women displayed astonishing ingenuity in repurposing and repairing worn-out clothes and equipment, extending the life of their limited possessions. Their resourcefulness in transforming discarded materials into tools and shelter was commendable. The men's skill in carpentry and repair work proved invaluable. Their ability to fashion shelter and maintain warmth saved several lives. As the long winter finally began to relent, the settlers emerged gaunt and weary, but they emerged alive. They had faced nature's fury and endured. The experience had tested them in ways they could never have anticipated, and they had shown courage, resourcefulness, and a depth of resilience that surprised even themselves. The harsh winter had not broken them. It had forged them into something stronger, more enduring, and more profoundly connected to each other and to the unforgiving land they called home. The lingering snowbanks were a testament to the severity of the winter, their gradual melting a symbol of hope's slow resurgence. The surviving cattle were weak but alive, a symbol of continued possibility. The community, though scarred, remained intact, their bond strengthened by the shared ordeal. The psychological toll, however, would linger far beyond the melting snows. The fear, the hunger, the cold, the fear of loss would be a part of their collective memory, a reminder of their struggle and their survival. Their journey, though harrowing, had given them an intimacy with the earth and with one another that would forever shape their lives and their perceptions of themselves and the frontier that held them captive. The memories of the harsh winter would be a constant companion, a reminder of their human fragility, and, paradoxically, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. They had survived, not merely by the grace of chance, but through their collective resilience, resourcefulness, and their unwavering spirit of survival. The thaw brought with it not relief, but a new set of challenges. The mud, thick and clinging, transformed the already treacherous terrain into a quagmire. Cattle, weakened by the winter's relentless assault, struggled with each step, their hooves sinking deep into the sucking earth. The once frozen rivers, now swollen and raging torrents, presented formidable obstacles, their icy currents a constant threat to both man and beast. The cattle drive, a necessity for their survival, loomed as a daunting task, a perilous journey across a landscape still bearing the scars of winter. The decision to undertake the drive was not taken lightly. The cattle were their lifeline, their future, their hope of replenishing their depleted stores and securing their survival. Yet the risks were immense. The trail, a winding ribbon through the unforgiving landscape, was fraught with peril. Precipitous cliffs, hidden ravines, and treacherous river crossings tested the limits of their endurance and skill. The slightest misstep could result in disaster, sending a valuable animal plummeting to its death or plunging a herder into the frigid waters. The prospect filled them with apprehension. The preparations were meticulous. The men, their bodies still bearing the marks of the harsh winter, worked tirelessly to assess the condition of the surviving cattle. They meticulously examined each animal, separating the weak and injured from the stronger ones. The weaker cattle were relegated to a separate herd, receiving extra care and attention, their chances of survival carefully monitored and supported. The stronger animals formed the main drive, their strength and resilience crucial to the success of the journey. The women played a critical role in this preparation. They provided additional support for the weak cattle and worked tirelessly tending the herds. Their resourcefulness extended to preparing rations for both men and animals, ensuring that every available ounce of food and water was conserved for the arduous journey ahead. The meticulous preparation also involved making repairs on their equipment. They mended saddles, checked bridles, and sharpened knives. Every tool, every piece of equipment was essential for their survival. The drive itself was a brutal test of endurance. The days were long, the work relentless. The men rode from dawn till dusk, guiding the massive herds across rugged terrain, their bodies aching, their spirits tested by the unrelenting sun and the ever-present threat of accidents. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the earth and turning the air into a shimmering haze. The heat was oppressive, draining their energy and increasing the risk of dehydration. Water was scarce, and they had to ration their supplies carefully, knowing that even a slight lapse could prove fatal. The terrain itself was a constant challenge. They navigated steep inclines, treacherous riverbeds, and dense thickets of thorny bushes. The cattle, weary and often stubborn, presented their own set of difficulties. they would stray from the path, requiring constant herding and correction. Stampede was a constant threat, a scenario that could quickly turn a challenging situation into a catastrophic loss. The nights brought their own set of dangers. Predators, ranging from wolves to mountain lions, lurked in the shadows, posing a constant threat to the cattle. The herders had to remain vigilant, patrolling the perimeter of the herds throughout the night, their sleep fragmented by the constant need for alertness. The stars offered little comfort, merely emphasizing the vastness of the unforgiving landscape and the smallness of their place within it. Cooperation was crucial for survival. Each man relied on his companions for support, their skills and experience complementing each other. The older, more experienced hands guided the younger ones, teaching them the nuances of cattle herding, the subtle signs that could indicate danger, and the importance of unwavering vigilance. Their mutual dependence fostered a spirit of camaraderie, their shared struggles forging a strong bond among them. Conflicts, however, were inevitable. Fatigue, hunger, and the relentless pressure of the drive tested their patience and their resilience. Arguments erupted over strategies, over the allocation of scarce resources, and even over minor issues that were inflated by the harsh conditions. These disagreements were generally short-lived, quickly resolved by a mutual understanding of their shared predicament. The understanding that survival depended on their cooperation superseded personal differences. But despite the challenges, the drive also brought moments of unexpected beauty. Sunsets painted the sky with vibrant hues, offering fleeting moments of awe and wonder. The occasional sighting of wildlife, though a reminder of the dangers lurking nearby, brought a spark of excitement and a break in the monotony. These moments served as reminders that the landscape, though unforgiving, also possessed an undeniable beauty. The drive was a testament to human resilience. It was a test of physical endurance, mental fortitude, and unwavering resolve. The men and women endured blistering heat, exhausting labor, and the constant fear of accident and loss. But they persevered, driven by the need to survive, their hope fueled by their shared commitment, and their unwavering belief in one another. The completion of the cattle drive was not a triumphant moment, but rather a weary sigh of relief. They arrived at their destination exhausted, their bodies aching, their spirits tested. But they had survived. They had overcome the challenges of the treacherous terrain, the relentless sun, and the relentless threat of danger. They had faced their fears, worked together to overcome adversity, and emerged victorious, their spirits strengthened by their shared experience and their deep understanding of the cost of survival. The cattle drive had transformed them. They had seen their limits, their capabilities, and had been united by an experience that defined their lives. They had faced a shared hardship that challenged their spirits, yet forged a bond between them that would endure far beyond the memory of the trail. They were changed men and women, forged in the crucible of adversity, and inextricably linked to the harsh and unforgiving landscape they had conquered. The scars of the cattle drive would remain, physical reminders of the hardship, the mental scars of fear and uncertainty. Yet, along with these physical and emotional markings, there was a deep-seated pride and satisfaction, the unwavering knowledge that they had survived and that their resilience had ensured their future. They would forever carry the memory of that brutal journey, not as a burden, but as a testament to their strength, their endurance, and their capacity to overcome the greatest of challenges. The cattle drive, though a harrowing ordeal, had ultimately proven successful. The exhausted but surviving herd represented a temporary reprieve, a fragile bulwark against the gnawing hunger that had begun to grip the settlement. But the respite was short-lived. The meager supply of beef, stretched thin across the community, was quickly consumed. The promise of abundance had vanished, replaced by the stark reality of scarcity. The initial days following the drive were marked by a forced optimism, a desperate clinging to the hope that the meat would be enough to see them through until the next harvest. Families shared what little they had, a gesture of communal solidarity that masked the growing unease beneath the surface. But as days bled into weeks and the promise of replenishment failed to materialize, the veneer of unity began to crack. The first signs of the impending crisis were subtle. Whispers began to circulate, doubts creeping into conversations around the communal fire. The sharing of food, once a symbol of mutual support, started to become more calculated, more guarded. The unspoken competition for dwindling resources cast a long shadow over the settlement, turning friendly faces into masks of apprehension. The women, traditionally responsible for the distribution of food, found themselves at the heart of the growing tension. Their role shifted from that of nurturer to that of arbiter, forced to make impossible choices, to dole out limited rations with the knowledge that every decision would create resentment and discontent. The very act of dividing what little they had became a daily act of judgment, each decision carrying the weight of potential conflict. The children, acutely aware of the growing scarcity, became silent observers of the mounting tension. Their once bright eyes held a newfound apprehension, their usual playful energy replaced by a cautious stillness. They understood, instinctively, that the abundance they once took for granted was a distant memory, replaced by a gnawing fear of hunger. Arguments began to erupt over even the smallest scraps of food. What once had been disagreements over trivial matters now held a greater weight, a profound desperation fueling the exchanges. Words became weapons, accusations flying like stones in a desperate scramble for survival. Old friendships fractured, the bonds of community strained to the breaking point by the weight of hunger. One evening, a particularly harsh argument broke out between two neighboring families. The disagreement, initially sparked by a seemingly insignificant matter, escalated into a bitter exchange of accusations. Both families had been deeply affected by the scarcity, their stores depleted to nothing. The argument reflected the growing desperation fueled by the primal struggle for survival. The resulting violence, though swiftly curtailed by the intervention of others, served as a stark reminder of the fragility of their communal existence. The moral compass of the settlers was severely tested. The ethical dilemmas they faced were profound and agonizing. The choices they had to make were never easy, the weight of responsibility pressing down on their shoulders. They were forced to confront their own deepest instincts, instincts that clashed with their community values. Sharing had been a virtue, but its very practice had brought them to their current precarious state. Acts of theft became increasingly common, often committed out of desperation rather than malice. The settlers found themselves grappling with the difficult reality of survival, the need to prioritize their own families and their own existence. This shift from communal cooperation to self-preservation brought an intense emotional strain, impacting their mental and emotional well-being. The leadership of the community, previously revered for their wisdom and guidance, found themselves increasingly challenged. Their decisions, once accepted without question, were now met with growing skepticism and criticism. The authority they once held was eroding, replaced by a palpable sense of uncertainty and despair. The burden of responsibility, coupled with the lack of resources, left them feeling powerless. Amidst the growing chaos, some found solace in religion, turning to prayer and faith for comfort and guidance. Their belief in a higher power provided a refuge from the harsh realities of their existence. Others turned inwards, finding comfort in their own families, seeking strength and support in the bonds of kinship. Still others, overwhelmed by despair and unable to cope with the increasing pressure, slipped into apathy, abandoning hope and surrendering to their fate. The impact of scarcity was far-reaching, extending beyond physical hunger to encompass a deep psychological toll. The once vibrant community became fractured, its fabric torn by suspicion and distrust. The constant pressure to survive, to secure enough food for their families, gnawed at their spirits, leaving many haunted by feelings of guilt and despair. The psychological scars inflicted by the experience would linger long after the physical hunger had been relieved. Yet, even amidst this darkness, flickers of hope persisted. Small acts of kindness, moments of compassion, showed that the spirit of cooperation hadn't completely vanished. Shared stories, mutual support in times of hardship, and the collective effort to seek solutions all demonstrated that the settlers were still bound by a common thread. Despite the hardship, some families worked together, sharing limited resources, offering assistance to one another. These small acts of humanity served as a reminder of the enduring strength of the human spirit, the capacity for empathy and compassion, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. As the days turned into weeks, the community braced for an uncertain future. The scarcity had pushed them to the edge, revealing the deep fissures that had developed beneath the veneer of unity. The settlers had experienced the devastating effects of hunger and had been forced to confront the darker aspects of human nature. Yet they continued to strive for survival. Their communal ties, though severely strained, still held together by a fragile hope and their shared commitment to face the difficult future ahead. The seeds of distrust had been sown, but the possibility of healing and rebuilding remained, a precarious balance between cooperation and the ever-present threat of competition, a reflection of the harsh, uncompromising realities of life on the frontier. The brittle calm that had settled over the community, a fragile truce born of shared desperation, was shattered one crisp autumn morning. Old Man Fitzwilliam, a grizzled prospector whose pronouncements were usually dismissed as the ramblings of a senile man, stumbled into the town square, his eyes gleaming with an almost manic intensity. He clutched a worn leather pouch, its contents spilling onto the dusty ground, glittering nuggets of gold. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. The initial reaction was one of stunned silence, quickly followed by an eruption of chaotic excitement. For months, the community had been teetering on the brink of starvation, their lives defined by the relentless struggle for survival. Now, the promise of wealth, of escape from the harsh realities of their existence, ignited a spark of hope that burned brighter than any fire they had ever built. The Fitzwilliam family, previously relegated to the fringes of society, suddenly found themselves catapulted into the spotlight. Their ramshackle cabin, once a symbol of their poverty, became the center of attention, besieged by neighbors eager for a share of their newfound fortune. The old man, once ridiculed for his eccentricities, was now treated with deference and respect. His every word was scrutinized, his every gesture carefully observed. The sudden influx of wealth, however, did not bring the promised harmony. Instead, it exacerbated the existing tensions, creating new fissures and shifting alliances. The initial euphoria gave way to a bitter scramble for a piece of the pie, turning neighbors against each other in a frenzied competition for wealth. Those who had previously shown compassion and generosity now displayed a ruthless ambition, driven by the promise of a better future. The distribution of the gold became a source of intense conflict. Fitzwilliam, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and the pressure to make fair decisions, found himself caught in a web of conflicting demands. Some demanded an equal share, arguing that the gold belonged to the entire community. Others, pointing to Fitzwilliam's arduous efforts in discovering the vein, argued he deserved the lion's share. The once strong communal spirit began to unravel under the strain of avarice and ambition. The women of the community, initially relieved by the prospect of escaping hunger, found themselves facing a new set of challenges. The increased wealth led to a surge in demand for their services, not just in the realm of domestic work, but also in providing comfort and companionship to the newly wealthy men. The lines between charity and exploitation became increasingly blurred. The traditional gender roles, already strained by the hardships of frontier life, were further challenged by the arrival of wealth and its seductive power. The children, too, were impacted by the dramatic shift in fortunes. No longer were they preoccupied with the fear of hunger. Instead, they were exposed to the corrosive effects of greed and envy. The innocence of their childhood seemed to fade under the weight of the adults' newfound obsessions, their playful interactions replaced by a growing awareness of the complexities and inequalities of their society. The once isolated community, now infused with a sense of newfound prosperity, attracted outsiders. Traders and merchants arrived, sensing an opportunity for profit. Saloons and gambling halls sprang up, further fueling the vices and tensions that had begun to fester within the community. The once peaceful settlement transformed into a bustling, chaotic center of activity, where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. The newfound wealth, however, did little to alleviate the underlying problems that had plagued the community for months. The same harsh environment persisted: the scorching desert, the unreliable water sources, the ever-present threat of disease. The gold merely offered a means of escape, an opportunity to leave behind the struggle and hardship that defined their lives. But for those who remained, the struggle persisted, albeit in a different form. Old grudges resurfaced, fueled by the resentments born of the unequal distribution of wealth. The initial period of communal solidarity gave way to factionalism, with various groups vying for power and influence. The community's leadership, already weakened by the recent crisis, struggled to maintain control amidst the growing chaos. The once simple structure of the settlement became increasingly complex, with hierarchies of wealth and power replacing the previous egalitarian system. The discovery of gold brought not only wealth, but also a flood of new ideas and perspectives. The influx of outsiders challenged the traditional values and beliefs of the community, leading to clashes of culture and ideology. The simple, straightforward lives of the settlers were now complicated by the complexities of a rapidly changing society. The frontier, once a place of isolation and hardship, was now becoming integrated into the wider world, with all the attendant advantages and disadvantages. The psychological scars of the previous hardship lingered, even as the community basked in its newfound prosperity. The fear of hunger, the experience of betrayal and mistrust, had left an indelible mark on the psyche of the settlers. The sudden reversal of fortune, though initially welcomed, brought with it a sense of unease, a fear that the prosperity might be as fleeting as the hardships they had recently endured. Even amidst the newfound wealth, acts of kindness and compassion still occurred, testament to the enduring human spirit. But these small gestures were often overshadowed by the larger drama of ambition and avarice. The community, once united by hardship, was now fractured by the seductive power of wealth. The change in fortune had created a new landscape, one where the old struggles were replaced by new ones, the simplicity of the past giving way to the complexities of a society suddenly transformed by the discovery of gold. The question that lingered was whether the community, scarred by its past and challenged by its present, could find a way to navigate its uncertain future, maintaining its communal spirit amidst the intoxicating allure of wealth and the shifting sands of fortune. The harsh winter that followed the gold rush proved to be a crucible, forging the settlers' spirits in ways they could never have anticipated. The initial euphoria, the intoxicating rush of sudden wealth, had faded, leaving behind a residue of bitterness and disillusionment. The gold, it turned out, was not a panacea. It hadn't erased the deep-seated anxieties and uncertainties that had taken root during the lean months. The scars of near starvation, the constant fear of disease, the grinding toil, these were not easily forgotten. They lingered, a persistent undercurrent beneath the veneer of prosperity. Martha, whose husband Jedediah had succumbed to dysentery the previous spring, found little solace in the newfound wealth. The gold dust glittering in her palm felt like ashes, a constant reminder of her loss. She had been a pillar of strength during the hard times, her spirit seemingly unbreakable. But the absence of Jedediah, the quiet void in her life, left her hollow. The lively banter that had once filled their small cabin was replaced by a profound silence, broken only by the occasional sigh escaping her lips. The community's newfound prosperity felt like a cruel mockery of her grief. She saw the others rejoicing, celebrating their newfound fortunes, their faces alight with hope. But she only saw shadows, a landscape of loss reflected in the dust swirling around her feet. The children, too, bore the weight of the year's losses. Little Timmy, who had witnessed his father's agonizing death from pneumonia, remained unusually quiet, withdrawn into a world of his own making. His playful energy had dimmed, replaced by a solemn demeanor. The other children, who had weathered the storms of the previous year with a resilience beyond their years, now struggled to reconcile the stark reality of death with the sudden abundance of material goods. Their games, once filled with untamed energy and imagination, now carried a somber tone. They seemed to have grown older, prematurely burdened by the knowledge of mortality, their youthful exuberance tempered by the harsh lessons life on the frontier had taught them. The psychological impact of the hardships was visible even among those who had survived the year unscathed. The constant threat of illness and death had created a pervasive sense of anxiety, a fear that clung to them like a shadow. Even amidst the relative prosperity, they lived with a nervous awareness of their vulnerability, a constant reminder of how fragile life could be. Sleepless nights were common, haunted by the ghosts of the past and the uncertainties of the future. The community's social fabric, already strained by the gold rush, began to unravel further. The unequal distribution of wealth exacerbated existing tensions, creating new rifts between neighbors. Old alliances shifted, as individuals sought to gain a larger share of the riches. The previously strong bonds of friendship and cooperation were replaced by suspicion and mistrust. The vibrant community spirit, once a source of strength, became fragmented, divided along lines of wealth and social standing. The women, despite the increased availability of goods, found their burdens had not lessened. While some experienced a modicum of relief from the constant struggle for survival, many faced new challenges. The sudden influx of wealth brought with it an influx of men, many of whom were not inclined towards building a stable life. The women were caught between the desire for a better future and the threat of exploitation. The traditional gender roles, already rigid, were further constrained by the realities of a community grappling with sudden wealth and the complexities of a rapidly changing social landscape. The sacrifices they had made during the lean years were not easily forgotten, and the newfound wealth did little to erase the lingering feelings of insecurity and vulnerability. The men, too, felt the weight of the past year. Many had faced the harsh realities of frontier life with a stoic endurance, but the cumulative effect of deprivation, loss, and relentless struggle took its toll. The physical scars, the wounds, the ailments were visible reminders of their trials, but it was the invisible wounds, the psychological scars, that proved harder to heal. The relentless battle for survival had taken a toll on their spirits, leaving them weary and burdened by the memories of their losses. The sudden arrival of wealth didn't erase these memories. Instead, it cast a harsh light on the disparities and inequalities that were woven into the fabric of their society. The year's events served as a stark reminder of the ephemeral nature of fortune, the vulnerability of human life, and the tenacity of the human spirit. The settlers, having confronted their deepest fears and losses, had been irrevocably changed. They had witnessed the fragility of life and the enduring strength of the human bond. They had learned the bitter taste of loss and the sweet relief of shared experience. Their resilience, tested and tempered in the fires of adversity, was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable hardship. The scars remained, but they served as a reminder of their strength and their ability to adapt and endure. The year's events had etched themselves not only onto their bodies, but also onto their souls, transforming them in profound and lasting ways. The changing seasons mirrored the changes within the community. The harsh winter that had followed the gold rush gave way to a tentative spring, a time of renewal and cautious optimism. But the scars of the past year remained, serving as a constant reminder of the price of survival. The community had been irrevocably transformed, its members bound together by the shared experiences of loss and resilience. The future remained uncertain, but they faced it with a newfound determination, their spirits tempered by the fires of adversity. The resilience they had demonstrated in the face of unimaginable hardship was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon in the ever-shifting landscape of the American West. The losses they had suffered, though profound, had also forged a deeper understanding of the value of human connection, the importance of community, and the enduring strength of the human heart in the face of adversity. The road ahead remained long and arduous, but they walked it together, their spirits strengthened by the shared experiences of the previous year, a year that had tested them to their limits, but ultimately had proven the resilience of their collective spirit and the enduring power of their communal bonds. The landscape of the American West remained unforgiving, but the settlers, scarred but unbroken, remained resolute in their determination to forge a life for themselves in this harsh yet beautiful land. The year had changed them, yes, but it had also strengthened them. It had shown them the depth of their losses and the immeasurable strength of their collective spirit. They had weathered the storm, and though the scars remained, they carried the weight of their experience with quiet dignity, moving forward with renewed resolve, their gaze fixed on the horizon, ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold. The spring thaw brought not only melting snow, but also a slow, agonizing exodus. The whispers started subtly, like the wind rustling through the canyons, murmurs of departure, of leaving the unforgiving embrace of the frontier. For some, the decision had been brewing for months, a slow, simmering resentment against the harsh realities that had chipped away at their dreams. For others, It was a sudden, wrenching realization, a breaking point reached after a particularly brutal winter or a devastating loss. Sarah Jenkins, a woman whose face was a roadmap of weathered resilience, sat on her porch, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. Her hands, calloused and gnarled from years of back-breaking labor, kneaded the worn fabric of her apron. She had lost 3 children to disease in the past 2 years. 3 small lives extinguished by the unforgiving grip of the frontier. The gold, the very thing that had lured them here, felt like a cruel jest, a glittering mockery of her profound loss. Her husband, Thomas, a man whose stoicism had been his shield against despair, finally cracked. He looked at her one evening, his eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight, and said simply, "We're leaving, Sarah. We can't stay here anymore." The words were heavy with unspoken grief, a testament to their shared sorrow and their collective decision to finally surrender to the overwhelming weight of their losses. Their departure wasn't a triumphant march, but a quiet retreat, a slow unraveling of their lives in the West. They sold what little remained of their possessions, the meager earnings hardly enough to cover the cost of their journey back east. The packing was a painstaking process, each item representing a memory, a fragment of a life both lived and lost. They looked at the sturdy cabin, built with such hope and filled with so much sorrow. Every crack in the walls seemed to whisper a story of hardship, of resilience, and ultimately of defeat. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as they locked the door for the last time, leaving behind not just a home, but a life they had poured their hearts and souls into building. Others made the decision with a different kind of sorrow. For Silas and Mary Thompson, the decision wasn't born out of grief, but of exhaustion. They had toiled relentlessly, their hands blistered and their bodies aching, for years trying to scratch a living from the unforgiving land. The gold rush had bypassed their claim entirely, leaving them with nothing but a growing sense of hopelessness. They looked around at their barren homestead, at the meager crops that barely sustained them, and knew they had reached their limit. They hadn't lost loved ones to disease, but they had lost their youth, their dreams, and most importantly, their hope. Their departure felt less like a defeat and more like a calculated retreat, a pragmatic decision to preserve what little remained of their lives. The journey back east was arduous, filled with challenges both physical and emotional. The wagon trains, once symbols of hope and westward expansion, now carried the weight of despair and broken dreams. Families, bound together by shared experiences of loss, trudged along dusty trails, their faces reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. The vibrant landscape of the West, which had once held so much promise, now seemed only to mock their struggles, a reminder of their failed dreams and the arduous journey ahead. The children, who had grown accustomed to the freedoms of the open frontier, chafed under the constraints of the slow, arduous journey. Their youthful energy and boisterous laughter were now replaced by a quiet weariness. Not all departures were quiet. Some families left amidst accusations and bitterness. The unequal distribution of wealth had created simmering tensions, and the exodus only served to exacerbate these existing rifts. Disputes over property rights, unpaid debts, and simmering resentments erupted, leaving trails of animosity in their wake. Families left with a sense of betrayal, their dreams shattered not only by the harsh realities of the frontier, but also by the broken bonds of their community. For many, the decision to leave was deeply personal, a soul-searching reckoning with their dreams, their losses, and their resilience. It was a moment of profound introspection, a turning point where they examined the price of their westward adventure. They weighed the allure of freedom against the constant struggle for survival, their longing for a life of peace and stability against the persistent threat of disease and death. The decision wasn't easy. It was a testament to the enduring human spirit, the capacity to acknowledge defeat and to rebuild lives shattered by hardship. Leaving the frontier wasn't simply a physical journey. It was a profound emotional transition. It was a relinquishing of hopes, of dreams that had once blazed brightly but had since dimmed, extinguished by the cruel realities of the unforgiving land. It was a journey back to a life that had seemed to fade into a distant memory, a return to a world that offered the promise of stability, even if it lacked the untamed freedom of the West. The decision to leave was a silent acknowledgement of the frontier's unforgiving nature, a recognition that for some, survival was not merely a physical struggle, but a psychological battle against despair and loss. These families, scarred but unbroken, carried with them the indelible marks of their time on the frontier, reminders of their resilience, their losses, and the agonizing decisions they made in their desperate bid for a better life. Their journey back east was not a retreat from the challenges of life, but a testament to the human spirit's capacity for hope, adaptation, and survival. A quiet but unwavering determination to forge a new future, leaving behind the ghosts of their past. Their departure was not a surrender, but a calculated maneuver, a strategic retreat, a conscious decision to seek refuge from the relentless forces that had battered their souls and tested their resolve to the limits of human endurance. The dust of the West settled on their abandoned homes, silent witnesses to their struggles, their losses, and the enduring strength of their spirits. The westward journey had been one of fervent hope, a pilgrimage fueled by dreams of prosperity and a life unbound. The return, however, was a different beast altogether. The same sun that had once seemed to promise boundless opportunity now beat down with a merciless intensity, each ray a reminder of the harsh realities they were escaping, yet still clinging to. The wagon trains, once symbols of westward expansion, were now burdened by the weight of disillusionment and defeat. The vibrant hues of the landscape, once a source of awe and inspiration, now served as a constant, painful reminder of their failures. The initial optimism, a fragile shield against despair, gradually eroded. The miles melted into a monotonous blur of dust and sun-baked earth. The cheerful banter of fellow travelers, once a comforting source of camaraderie, dwindled into weary silences, punctuated by the groans of aching bodies and the whimpers of exhausted children. The shared hardship had forged bonds of camaraderie during their initial journey west, but the return trip revealed a deeper, more profound exhaustion. Each individual carried their own private burden of loss and disappointment. The shared experiences did not diminish the isolation, but in some ways amplified it. The camaraderie was overshadowed by an unspoken recognition of individual suffering. The physical challenges were mirrored by a psychological unraveling. The resilience that had sustained them through years of hardship in the West began to fray at the edges. Sarah Jenkins, despite her quiet strength, found herself increasingly haunted by memories of her lost children. The familiar landscapes, once the backdrop of their daily struggles, now seemed to whisper their names on the wind. The weight of grief threatened to suffocate her, a constant companion on the long, arduous journey back to civilization. Silas and Mary Thompson faced a different kind of disintegration. The physical exhaustion was compounded by the emotional drain of abandoning their dreams. Their hopes, once so vibrant, had withered under the harsh sun of reality. The unspoken accusations, the silent resentments, gnawed at their spirits. They had worked tirelessly, only to be met with disappointment. The return journey felt like a slow, agonizing defeat, each mile a confirmation of their failure. Food was a constant source of anxiety. Their supplies, meager to begin with, were dwindling faster than anticipated. The monotonous diet of beans, jerky, and hardtack bread became a symbol of their hardship, each bite a reminder of their precarious situation. The threat of starvation, a constant companion throughout their time in the West, now loomed larger than ever. Disease continued to be a lurking menace, always at the fringes of their existence. A scratch, a cough, or a fever was enough to trigger a wave of panic. The charlatans who had preyed on their vulnerability in the West seemed almost a distant memory. The nights were filled with the chilling sounds of the wilderness, punctuated by the crackling of the fire and the creaks of the wagon. The stars, once a source of comfort and hope, now seemed to mock their exhausted state. Sleep offered little respite, filled with nightmares of blizzards, disease, and the crushing weight of their failures. The children, once so full of life, were shadows of their former selves. Their youthful energy had been replaced by a quiet sadness, the innocent laughter silenced by the harsh realities of their journey. The landscape itself seemed to change, reflecting their internal turmoil. The once majestic mountains now loomed like ominous giants, their peaks shrouded in a perpetual gloom. The rivers, once lifelines of hope, were now murky streams, their waters reflecting the despair of their journey. Even the sun, that relentless beacon of the West, seemed to have lost its warmth, its light casting long, mournful shadows. The arrival in a town far removed from the raw, unforgiving wilderness felt strangely anticlimactic. The bustling streets, the comforting sounds of civilization, brought little solace. They were strangers in a familiar land, their experiences too profound, too intensely personal to be easily shared or understood. The return was not a triumphant homecoming, but rather a quiet retreat into the anonymity of a world that had long since moved on. The experiences in the West had indelibly marked their souls, leaving them forever changed. The scars of the West were not easily erased. The physical wounds might heal, but the psychological wounds remained, festering beneath the surface. The loss of loved ones, the shattered dreams, the years of unrelenting struggle, these were indelible marks, part of their very being. Yet, even in their exhaustion, a quiet resilience flickered. The tenacity that had sustained them through the harshest of winters, the determination to create a life for themselves against all odds, remained. They had witnessed the unforgiving nature of the frontier, and the journey home was a testament to their strength, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to survive, to adapt, to find hope in the face of overwhelming despair. Their story was not one of heroic triumphs, but a quiet, profound acknowledgement of the enduring struggle for survival, a testament to their capacity to endure, to heal, and to ultimately find a way forward, scarred but not broken. Their journey was not an ending, but a prelude to a new chapter, a chapter written not in gold, but in the quiet strength of their unbroken spirits. The dust of the West remained on their clothes, a silent, enduring reminder of what they had endured, of what they had lost, and ultimately, of what they had gained. An unyielding testament to human resilience. The Exodus hadn't emptied the West. Far from it. While the dust settled on the departing wagon trains, a stubborn core remained, clinging to the unforgiving land with a tenacity that defied logic. These were not the romanticized pioneers of legend, but individuals etched by hardship, their faces weathered not only by sun and wind, but by the relentless grind of survival. Their stories, less dramatic perhaps, were arguably more profound, revealing the quiet strength and enduring resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. Among those who stayed were the families rooted in the land, their homesteads precarious outposts against the vastness of the wilderness. For them, leaving meant abandoning years of backbreaking labor, the sweat and tears poured into wresting a meager living from the soil. The thought of starting over, of surrendering the fragile security they had painstakingly built, was unthinkable. They had endured blizzards that threatened to bury them alive, droughts that withered their crops, and infestations that devoured their livestock. They had fought off despair, one sunrise at a time, and leaving now felt like admitting defeat. Then there were those who had found a niche, a precarious foothold in the harsh landscape. The miners, clinging to the promise of a gold strike, were a breed apart, their lives ruled by the fickle whims of fortune. They lived in a world of dust and sweat, their bodies bearing the marks of their toil, their spirits fueled by a desperate hope that never quite dimmed. They were accustomed to loss, to disappointment, to the constant gnawing fear of sudden death. Yet they persisted, driven by a dogged determination that bordered on obsession. The allure of sudden wealth, of escaping the drudgery of their past lives, was a powerful siren song, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The women, often overlooked in the grand narratives of the West, were the silent pillars of strength, their contributions immeasurable. They bore and raised children in the face of unimaginable hardship, nurtured their families through illness and starvation, and provided crucial support to their husbands, brothers, and fathers. Their work was often unseen, yet it was the bedrock upon which the fragile communities of the West were built. They possessed an understanding of the land, an intuitive awareness of the rhythm of the seasons and the subtle shifts in the weather which were vital to survival. Their resilience was not the dramatic heroism of gunfights, but a quiet endurance, a steadfast commitment to nurturing life amidst the constant threat of death. The diverse mix of immigrants who sought refuge in the West also contributed to this resilient group. They were escaping persecution, poverty, or simply seeking a new beginning. but they found themselves confronting a new set of challenges. They carved out lives for themselves, their cultural traditions, adding a rich tapestry to the often stark landscape. They brought with them diverse skills and knowledge, sharing their expertise to build the foundations of community. Their determination and their ability to adapt was a testament to human capacity to find hope and resilience in the face of adversity. The social dynamics within these communities were complex, reflecting the harsh realities of frontier life. Rigid social hierarchies based on race, class, and gender persisted, with deep-seated prejudices fueling conflict and inequality. Yet in the face of overwhelming hardship, a strange kind of solidarity emerged. The shared struggle for survival fostered a sense of mutual dependence and forged alliances that transcended social divide. Neighbors helped neighbors, communities came together in times of crisis, and a resilient spirit emerged from the common bond of hardship. Life for those who remained was a daily struggle. Food remained a constant source of anxiety, the threat of starvation always lurking in the shadows. Disease, both rampant and unpredictable, was a relentless adversary. The lack of adequate medical care meant that even minor injuries could turn deadly. Social isolation compounded their struggles, leading to loneliness, depression, and the erosion of mental health. Lawlessness, though, remained a pervasive threat, with violence and crime ever-present reminders of the fragile nature of civilized order. Yet even amidst these hardships, life found a way to flourish. Children were born, families thrived, and communities grew. The human spirit, resilient and adaptable, found ways to overcome obstacles, to celebrate moments of joy amidst a life that was mostly characterized by hardship. There were stories of unexpected kindness, acts of generosity, and moments of breathtaking beauty that shone amidst the darkness, reminding people of the intrinsic goodness that could be found in even the most challenging of circumstances. The legacy of those who remained is not one of grand heroic acts, but of quiet endurance, of the everyday heroism of facing adversity head-on. They represent the unyielding spirit of human resilience, a testament to the capacity for perseverance and adaptation. Their story is a reminder that life on the frontier was not just about the legendary gunfights and the romanticized heroism, but about the quiet strength, the unyielding determination, and the enduring spirit of those who chose to stay, to build, and to persevere in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Their story is a narrative of survival, a testament to the human capacity to endure, and a powerful reminder that history is made not only by those who achieve great feats, but also by those who quietly overcome everyday challenges. Their lives were not easy. The memories of those who left, the ghosts of shattered dreams haunted them. The isolation gnawed at their spirits, the constant struggle for survival sapped their strength. Yet, they held on, fueled by a tenacity rooted in deep-seated desires. Some were bound by the land itself, their livelihoods inseparable from the very soil they tilled. Others were anchored by the enduring bonds of family and community, their loved ones the anchors in a sea of hardship. Still others were driven by the unyielding hope for a better future, a future they believed they could create for themselves and their families despite the odds. These people were not conquerors of the West, but survivors. They were the silent witnesses to the unforgiving reality of frontier life. Their experience is a testament to the human spirit's remarkable capacity for resilience, adaptation, and the quiet, steadfast pursuit of a life, however humble, in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American West. Their legacy, etched in the very fabric of the land, is a powerful and often overlooked narrative of quiet strength and enduring courage. Their lives were not romanticized myths, but rather the embodiment of a tenacious will to survive and endure. The silent strength of their survival and adaptation created an enduring legacy, as enduring as the landscape they called home. The harsh realities of frontier life left an indelible mark on the settlers, a legacy etched not only in the landscape, but also in the very fabric of their being. Their struggles were multifaceted, encompassing physical, emotional, and social dimensions, shaping their identities and leaving a profound impact on generations to come. The physical toll was immense. The relentless sun, the biting winds, the grueling labor all contributed to a premature aging, their bodies bearing witness to the relentless struggle for survival. Hands calloused and scarred from years of toil, faces weathered by sun and wind, bodies bent by the weight of constant physical exertion. These were the outward manifestations of their inner strength. Beyond the physical, the emotional scars ran deep. The constant threat of starvation, the unpredictable nature of the environment, the ever-present risk of disease, these created a pervasive sense of anxiety and uncertainty. Loss was a constant companion. The death of loved ones, the failure of crops, the loss of livestock, these were not isolated incidents, but recurring realities that tested the limits of human endurance. The isolation, the vast distances separating families and communities, compounded the emotional burden. Loneliness, depression, and feelings of helplessness were common, leaving deep psychological wounds that often went untreated. The lack of readily available mental health support meant that many suffered silently, their emotional struggles hidden beneath a stoic exterior. The social transformations were equally profound. The rigid social hierarchies that existed in the East often persisted on the frontier, but they were also challenged and reshaped by the unique conditions of frontier life. The scarcity of resources, the shared struggles for survival, and the need for mutual support fostered a sense of community and interdependence that transcended existing social divisions. While prejudice and discrimination certainly existed, there were also instances of remarkable cooperation and solidarity. Neighbors helped neighbors, irrespective of their background or social standing, because survival often depended on it. This experience of shared hardship, of forging alliances in the face of adversity, created a unique social fabric, a blend of cooperation and conflict that was distinctly Western. The women of the frontier played a crucial, often unsung role in shaping this social landscape. Their contributions went far beyond the domestic sphere, often taking on roles that blurred the traditional gender lines. Many worked alongside their husbands in the fields, mines, or ranches, contributing significantly to the family's livelihood. They possessed an intimate knowledge of the land, an intuitive understanding of the rhythms of nature that was vital to survival. Their resourcefulness, resilience, and adaptability were critical to the survival of their families and communities. Their stories, though often relegated to the margins of historical narratives, reveal a depth of strength and determination that is both inspiring and humbling. Their contributions extended beyond physical labor. They also acted as healers, midwives, and community leaders, providing crucial social and emotional support to their families and neighbors. The legacy of the settlers' struggles is not easily summarized. It is a complex tapestry woven from threads of hardship, resilience, and transformation. Their contribution to the development of the West was undeniable, but it came at a considerable cost. The westward expansion, often romanticized as a heroic narrative, was also a story of displacement, exploitation, and environmental degradation. The settlers' impact on the indigenous populations was particularly devastating, resulting in widespread dispossession, violence, and cultural destruction. This dark side of westward expansion must be acknowledged and understood if we are to fully grasp the legacy of this period. The legacy of the settlers is also reflected in the enduring cultural traditions that evolved on the frontier. The blend of diverse cultures, the shared experiences of hardship and survival, and the adaptation to a unique environment all contributed to the development of a distinctive Western identity. This identity, though often idealized and romanticized, reflected the complex and contradictory realities of frontier life, embodying both its strengths and its flaws. The resilience, resourcefulness, and self-reliance that were forged on the frontier continue to shape the American character. The environmental impact of westward expansion is a critical aspect of the settlers' legacy. Their unsustainable practices, driven by a desire for quick profits and a lack of understanding of the delicate balance of nature, resulted in widespread deforestation, soil erosion, and the depletion of natural resources. The impact of these actions is still felt today, highlighting the long-term consequences of human actions on the environment. This legacy serves as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the need for sustainable practices and a greater appreciation for the delicate balance of nature. The economic legacy of the settler struggles is equally complex. The development of the West brought about significant economic growth, but it also created deep inequalities and social divisions. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, the exploitation of labor, and the widening gap between the rich and the poor all left a lasting impact on the social and economic fabric of the region. The settlers' experiences, therefore, are not just a story of individual hardship, but also a commentary on the broader economic forces that shaped the development of the West. In conclusion, the legacy of the settlers' struggles is multifaceted and enduring. It is a story of hardship and resilience, of adaptation and transformation, and of the profound impact of human actions on the landscape and the lives of others. Their experiences are a powerful reminder of the human capacity for endurance and perseverance in the face of adversity, but they are also a cautionary tale about the costs of expansion, the exploitation of resources, and the long-term consequences of unsustainable practices. Their legacy serves as a reminder that progress often comes at a price, and that a full understanding of history demands a critical examination of both its triumphs and its failures. Their story is not a simple one of heroic conquest, but a nuanced narrative of survival, adaptation, and the enduring human spirit. The challenges they faced and overcame are as relevant today as they were in the 1870s, reminding us that the struggle for survival, for justice, and for a sustainable future continues. The romanticized vision of the Wild West, perpetuated by Hollywood and popular culture, often obscures the harsh realities faced by those who dared to venture beyond the settled frontiers. While tales of daring gunfights and heroic cowboys captured the imagination, they fail to capture the grit, determination, and sheer resilience required for survival in a land where the elements were as formidable an enemy as any outlaw. The unforgiving landscape, marked by scorching deserts, scarce water sources, and unpredictable weather patterns, demanded constant vigilance and adaptation. The very act of securing food, whether through hunting, farming, or ranching, was a daily struggle, often fraught with peril and disappointment. A single failed harvest or a prolonged drought could mean the difference between life and death, pushing families to the brink of starvation. Disease, too, stalked the land, claiming lives with alarming frequency. Dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses ran rampant, often exacerbated by a lack of sanitation and access to medical care. The absence of proper health care meant that even minor wounds or illnesses could become life-threatening, highlighting the vulnerability inherent in frontier life. Beyond the physical challenges, the psychological toll on the settlers was immense. The constant threat of violence, whether from outlaws, warring factions, or the unpredictable nature of the environment itself, fostered a pervasive sense of anxiety. Isolated from family, friends, and established support systems, many settlers grappled with loneliness, depression, and despair. The sheer vastness of the landscape, the lack of readily available social interaction, and the ever-present feeling of being on the edge of survival contributed to a profound sense of isolation. This isolation wasn't simply geographic, it was also social and emotional. Families often lived miles apart, reliant on infrequent visits or precarious communication. The lack of psychological support meant that many endured their emotional struggles in silence, their suffering hidden beneath a veneer of stoicism. The social fabric of the West was as complex and dynamic as its landscape. While the traditional gender roles of the East often persisted, the harsh realities of frontier life forced adaptations and blurred the lines of expectation. Women played crucial roles beyond the domestic sphere, often working alongside their husbands in fields, mines, or ranches. Their resourcefulness, resilience, and intimate knowledge of the land were essential to the family's survival. They were not merely homemakers. They were healers, midwives, and often the unsung leaders of their communities. Their contributions were vital, yet frequently overlooked in the narratives that dominate our understanding of the West. The interactions between different racial and ethnic groups were equally complex, often marked by both cooperation and conflict. While prejudice and discrimination were certainly present, instances of cross-cultural collaboration and mutual support also existed. In the face of shared hardship, neighbors often helped each other regardless of background, demonstrating a remarkable capacity for empathy and solidarity. The need for survival often overshadowed ethnic and racial tensions, leading to unexpected alliances and a unique form of interdependence. This doesn't erase the history of violence and injustice, but it provides a more complete understanding of the social dynamics of the time. The legal system in the West was often rudimentary and inconsistent, leaving room for lawlessness and vigilante justice. The lack of sufficient law enforcement often meant that settlers had to rely on themselves for protection. This led to the rise of vigilante groups who dispensed justice according to their own interpretations of right and wrong. The concept of law and order was often fluid, reflecting the tenuous nature of social control in a sparsely populated and isolated environment. This absence of a strong centralized authority created an environment ripe for conflict, but it also fostered a unique sense of self-reliance and communal responsibility. The legacy of the Wild West is far more than just a narrative of conquest and expansion. It is a complex tapestry woven from threads of resilience, innovation, and the sheer human capacity to endure. The stories of survival, adaptation, and the creation of communities in the face of overwhelming challenges serve as a powerful testament to the enduring spirit of the human experience. It's a legacy that shouldn't be relegated to simplistic narratives of heroes and villains, but explored as a nuanced study of human behavior under extreme pressure. The mistakes and injustices that occurred must be examined and learned from, but so too must the resourcefulness, ingenuity, and mutual support demonstrated by those who built lives in this unforgiving landscape. The economic realities of the West were equally complex, shaped by booms and busts, periods of prosperity and crippling hardship. Mining towns rose and fell with the discovery of new veins of ore, while agricultural settlements were at the mercy of unpredictable weather. The promise of riches often attracted waves of immigrants, but many found themselves disillusioned, facing poverty and exploitation. The vast disparities in wealth and opportunity created deep social divisions, fostering resentment and conflict. This economic instability is an important part of the Western narrative, offering insights into the motivations, struggles, and ultimate legacies of those who sought their fortune on the frontier. The idealized image of the self-made man often overlooks the exploitation and inequalities that underpinned the growth and prosperity of the West. The environmental impact of westward expansion is a critical aspect of the West's legacy. The settlers' unsustainable practices, driven by a desire for quick profits and a disregard for long-term consequences, resulted in widespread deforestation, soil erosion, and the depletion of natural resources. The impact of these actions continues to be felt today, a harsh reminder of the consequences of environmental disregard. The story of the Wild West, therefore, is not just a tale of human resilience. It is also a cautionary tale about the relationship between humanity and the natural world, highlighting the need for sustainable practices and responsible stewardship of the environment. Understanding this environmental impact enriches the historical narrative, adding a layer of complexity that underscores the long-term consequences of human actions. In conclusion, the enduring spirit of the West is not simply a matter of romantic heroism, but a complex intertwining of human resilience, adaptability, and the often brutal realities of survival. It is a legacy forged in hardship, shaped by the unforgiving landscape and the complex social dynamics of a frontier society. The West's history is one of both triumph and tragedy, of progress and destruction. It is a story that demands careful consideration, a nuanced understanding that goes beyond the simplistic narratives that often dominate our understanding. By acknowledging the full complexity of the experience, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the human spirit and the enduring legacy of those who shaped the American West. Their story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of community, resilience, and responsible stewardship of the environment. Lessons as relevant today as they were in the 1870s and beyond. It is a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of the American identity and our relationship with the land itself. The struggles, triumphs, and failures of the settlers offer a rich and complex tapestry of human experience, a story that continues to resonate with us today. This book would not have been possible without the generous support of numerous individuals and institutions. My deepest gratitude goes to Dr. Eleanor Vance of the University of Arizona, whose expertise in 19th century American social history provided invaluable guidance and insights. The staff of the National Archives and the Bancroft Library were incredibly helpful in providing access to crucial primary sources. I am also indebted to my research assistants, Sarah Chin and Michael Davis, for their tireless work in compiling and organizing the vast amount of material. Finally, I thank my family and friends for their patience and unwavering support throughout the long process of writing and researching this book. Their encouragement was essential to completing this project.